They say the most dangerous man in the world isn't the one holding the gun. It's the one who has everything and feels nothing. Seo Jun Kang built an empire on fear. He owned politicians, buried enemies, and controlled half of Seoul's criminal underground before he turned 40. No one looked him in the eye. No one dared. But on New Year's Eve, a little girl in a pink dress waved at him from across a crowded restaurant. And in that single, weightless moment, the most feared man in South Korea forgot how to breathe. What happens next will stay with you long after the fireworks die. Like this video, drop your city in the comments below, and let's see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Geek. The city never slept, but on New Year's Eve, it howled. Seoul stretched out beneath a bone-white sky. Millions of bodies pressed against each other along the Han River embankment, every face tilted upward toward the promise of fireworks that hadn't arrived yet. The air tasted like gunpowder and grilled pork and cheap soju, and the cold cut through wool and leather like a blade through wet paper. Vendors shouted, children screamed with joy. Couples gripped each other as if the turning of the calendar required something physical to hold on to. Seo Jun Kang stood alone on the pedestrian bridge above Yeouido, both hands pushed into the pockets of his black overcoat, and watched all of it with the detached patience of a man observing fish in a tank. He was 41 years old. In another life, he might have been considered handsome, cheekbones carved by genetics and old hunger, jaw set hard enough to crack stone, eyes the color of river water in November. But years of doing what he had done to survive, and then to thrive, had settled into his face the way weather settles into old wood. Every line meant something. None of it was kind. The earpiece in his right ear crackled once. Boss? The voice belonged to Do-hyun, who had been Seo Jun's head of security for 11 years and still spoke to him as though one wrong syllable might set off an explosion. The Chung situation. Prosecutor Lim is requesting a meeting. Tonight. Tell him tonight doesn't exist. He says it's about the Incheon accounts. Seo-jun watched a small child below lose hold of a balloon. Red. It spiraled upward with the indifference of everything that escaped. Tell him I said tonight doesn't exist, Do-hyun. Was I unclear the first time? A pause. No, sir. Then stop asking me questions that are actually the same question. He pulled the earpiece out and slid it into his coat pocket. The balloon was already gone, swallowed by the dark between the city lights and the low clouds pressing down on Gangnam. Somewhere behind him, 3 of his men maintained a perimeter at exactly the distance he had specified, close enough to be useful, far enough that he could pretend they weren't there. He had built an organization that moved $100 million a year through construction fronts, logistics companies, and a chain of luxury hospitality properties stretching from Seoul to Singapore. He had survived 4 assassination attempts, 2 government investigations, and 1 war with the Kim Syndicate in Busan that had left 17 men dead and rearranged the entire southern criminal landscape to his advantage. Politicians returned his calls within the hour. Police superintendents knew better than to open files with his name on them without first checking who had sent the file and why. He had built all of it, brick by brick, threat by threat, year by year, and standing there on the bridge with Seoul celebrating beneath him, and the new year 40 minutes away, Seo Jun Kang felt something that none of his enemies had ever managed to produce in him. Nothing. Not quite nothing. More precise than that. A hollow ache behind the sternum, the kind of sensation you got when you reached for something that used to be there and found only the outline of where it had been. He recognized it distantly, the way you might recognize a word in a language you had studied as a child and mostly forgotten. He had felt it for the past 3 years, roughly. Maybe 4. It was hard to pinpoint the beginning of an absence. He pulled his collar up and left the bridge. The restaurant sat on the 22nd floor of the Hangang Premium Tower, a 60-story steel and glass monument to the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. The restaurant was called Chongsu, which meant clear water, and it served modern Korean cuisine at prices that functioned as a natural filter. The kind of place where the tablecloths cost more per meter than most people earned in a day. Seo Jun owned a 15% stake in the building through a holding company 3 layers deep, though the restaurant itself he had never actually visited. He visited it now because his driver, waiting at the base of the bridge, had mentioned it was nearby, because the wind had picked up, because Seo Jun simply had nowhere else to be. The host at the entrance was a young woman in a charcoal formal uniform who looked up from her reservation tablet with the practiced warmth of someone trained extensively to make powerful people feel expected. When Seo Jun gave no name, because he hadn't made a reservation, Her warmth did not waver, but her eyes performed a rapid calculation. "I'm so sorry, sir. We're fully reserved for the evening. It's New Year's, as you—" "I understand." He said it without heat. Not disappointed, not irritated. Just a statement of fact acknowledged. He turned to leave. He had reached the second step back toward the elevator when he heard it. A child's voice. High, clear, cutting through the soft jazz and the ambient murmur of expensive conversation like a stone thrown through a window. "Hey, hey, mister, over here!" Seojun stopped. He turned slowly, his way he turned toward any unexpected sound in any room. Not from politeness, but from the trained instinct of a man who had survived long enough to always know what was behind him. The dining room of Chongsu was a long, curved space that followed the building's arc, floor-to-ceiling windows on one side showing Seoul at night in all its irrational luminous sprawl. Every table was occupied. Candlelight and low pendant fixtures gave the room a quality of amber warmth. Dozens of faces had turned toward the sound of the child's voice with the mild alarm of people whose expensive evening had been interrupted. At a corner table near the window, a little girl was standing on her chair. She was perhaps 8 years old, small even for that, with close-cropped natural hair and a pink dress with a white sash tied in a bow at the back. Her skin was a deep, warm brown. She was waving at him with the unself-conscious urgency of someone who had spotted a friend across a crowded train platform. No hesitation, no calculation. Just the wave itself, pure and direct, as if it had never occurred to her that it might not be answered. Seojun looked over his shoulder to confirm that she was waving at him. He was the only person near the entrance. He looked back at the girl. She had not stopped waving. Every muscle in his body was calibrated for threat assessment, and in 11 seconds of rapid sensory processing, he had cataloged the room twice. The exits, the staff, the nearest occupied tables, the sight lines from the windows. There was no threat here. There was only a small child in a pink dress waving at him from across a restaurant on New Year's Eve. And the sensation this produced somewhere behind his ribs was one he could not immediately classify. The woman seated at the table reached up and put her hand gently on the child's arm, saying something low and quick. The child shook her head with firm 8-year-old certainty and continued waving. Seojun became aware that approximately 30 people were watching him. He walked toward the table. He moved between the occupied chairs and the gentle geography of other people's evenings. A couple in their 60s raising champagne flutes, a group of business associates in matching restraint, a young family where a toddler had managed to get something orange on the tablecloth. And he kept his eyes on the little girl, who had finally stopped waving and was now watching his approach with an expression of satisfaction, as if she had solved a problem. Up close, he could see her more clearly. She had bright, alert eyes that held the particular quality of children who observed everything and forgot nothing. The pink dress had a small grass stain near the hem that someone had tried to scrub out and not entirely succeeded. A half-eaten bowl of japchae sat in front of her, and she had apparently been using a spoon to construct some kind of architecture with the noodles before he appeared. The woman seated across from the child looked up at him, and Seojun took her in with a single glance the way he took in everything, completely and without appearing to. She was in her middle 30s, though she had the kind of face that could hold its age without revealing much. African American, her skin a shade darker than the child's, her natural hair pulled back with a few strands loose at the temples. She wore a deep burgundy dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of choice made by someone who had learned to dress well on a budget and hadn't entirely stopped thinking that way even when the budget expanded. She wore no rings, a single thin bracelet on her left wrist. Her posture, when he appeared, had straightened involuntarily, the instinctive response of someone who recognized on some animal level that the person approaching required attention. But her face had not gone to fear. It had gone instead to a careful, assessing watchfulness. Her jaw was set. Her hands rested flat on the table. She was deciding something. Seojun stopped at the edge of their table. "My daughter invited you," the woman said. Her Korean was fluent with an accent, American underneath, more specifically. Somewhere between New York and somewhere else, the kind of English as first language Korean that came from someone who had learned the language as an adult and learned it well and still carried the bones of another tongue beneath every syllable. "I apologize if that was—" "She did." Seojun looked at the child. "You did." The little girl nodded, unconcerned by his height or his coat or whatever it was that made adults in restaurants watch him without wanting to be caught watching him. "You looked lost," she said. In English now. Her English was immediate, natural, American-born or American-raised, no hesitation in it at all. You were standing there like you didn't know where to go. That's not good on New Year's. Seojun said nothing for a moment. Amara. The woman said it quietly, a gentle correction without heat. I'm Amara Johnson, the child said, as if her mother had provided an introduction rather than a mild rebuke. She extended her hand across the table with the seriousness of someone who had been taught that handshakes mattered. This is my mom, Naomi. We came to Seoul because she had a work thing, but now we're staying because we like it. Sojun looked at the small, offered hand. Then he shook it. Her fingers were warm and firm, and she gave 2 distinct pumps before releasing, which indicated someone who had practiced. Seojun, he said, is that your whole name? It's the name I use. Amara appeared to find this satisfactory. She looked at her mother. Can he sit with us? The restaurant is all full, and he doesn't have anywhere to go. She said this without preamble, without the particular guilty glance children deployed when trying to get away with something. She was simply stating facts and offering a logical solution. Naomi Johnson looked at Seojun. He watched her make the calculation, the rapid, quiet arithmetic of a woman alone with her daughter in a foreign country at night, assessing an unannounced man at her table. He had seen fear in that calculation before, the kind that lived in the body and didn't always show in the face. She was not exactly afraid. She was cautious, which was different and, in his estimation, considerably smarter. You don't have a reservation, she said. No. You could wait at the bar. I could. A pause. Neither of them moved. Amara watched them both with the focused intensity of a child adjudicating a negotiation she had personally initiated and intended to win. You can sit, Naomi said finally, if you want to. I'm not going to pretend Amara is going to stop looking at you until I say yes. Something close to a smile moved across his face. Not quite. The muscles weren't used to it. She's direct. She has been since she could talk. Naomi's voice held something in it. Not quite pride, not quite apology. The specific, complicated warmth of a parent who found a quality simultaneously exhausting and non-negotiable. Sit or don't, it's up to you. He sat. The waiter appeared within 40 seconds. Seojun ordered water, and after a moment, one of the omakase courses, because the host had already caught his eye across the room with the barely perceptible acknowledgement of a woman who had identified him immediately and was working urgently to make the situation appear intentional. Amara resumed her noodle architecture. Naomi wrapped her hands around her tea glass and watched him with the patient wariness of someone deciding how much to spend. What do you do? She asked. Real estate, he said. Mostly. Mostly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. He met her eyes. Hers were dark brown, steady, the kind of eyes that had learned to read people across language barriers and cultural gaps, and the ordinary human noise of information half given and half withheld. Logistics, he added, corporate consulting. That's a lot of industries. I've had a long career. Naomi's mouth shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement. She had decided something. He watched her do it. The precise moment the wariness didn't disappear but was placed to one side, set down in a controlled way, so that something else could occupy the space for a while. I work for a nonprofit, she said. International Educational Partnerships, teacher training programs in under-resourced schools. I've been in Seoul about 18 months. And before Seoul, New York. Before that, Baltimore. She looked at Amara, who had successfully connected 2 noodle arches into something load-bearing. Amara's done most of her growing up abroad, third culture kid. She speaks Korean better than most adults I know. The man at the dry cleaner says my tone is better than Mom's, Amara said without looking up from her construction. He said it was charming. That's different from better. He meant better, Amara said with total equanimity. Seojun watched this exchange. The texture of it, the unthinking ease between them, produced that hollow sensation again. But this time it was sharper, more specific, like pressing on a bruise you had forgotten was there. He had no one to speak to like that, no one who would contradict him with cheerful certainty and be entirely right. He drank his water. The meal arrived in courses, and Seojun ate with the focused economy of a man who ate alone and therefore ate quickly, until he realized he was not alone and that his pace was out of sync with the table, and he adjusted without comment. The kitchen at Cheongsu was exceptional. Hamachi with yuzu, a beef course with something fermented and clean, A small dish with sea vegetables and a foam that Amara regarded with profound suspicion before eating it anyway and announcing that it tasted like the ocean but good. Outside the windows, Seoul performed itself. The Han River sat wide and dark and cold, and around its banks the city's lights piled up against the night without apology. Towers, bridges, the steady moving chains of headlights, and above it all the low pressing gray of a winter sky about to become a new year. Seojun found himself watching Naomi more than he intended. She was not trying to be anything in particular. That was the quality he kept returning to. Most people in his presence tried to be something: impressive, unthreatening, useful, invisible. She was doing none of those things. She was eating her meal and managing her daughter and maintaining the kind of relaxed alertness that indicated neither fear nor performance. She was simply present in a way that most people around him had long since stopped being. "You said she waved at me because I looked lost," he said. Naomi glanced up. "Is that your word or hers?" "Hers," Naomi said. "Though I'll admit the reasoning wasn't entirely wrong." He looked out at the window. A cluster of fireworks went up somewhere south of the river. Too early, impatient, the individual concussions muffled by distance and glass. "I don't get lost," he said. The words came out more clipped than he intended. "No," Naomi said. "I don't think that's what she meant." Amara had set down her spoon. She was looking at him with the focused directness that he was beginning to understand was simply her default mode. Not rude, not aggressive, just oriented. The way certain animals locked onto you, not because they were planning anything, but because their attention, when it arrived, was total. "You were standing there by yourself looking at everything and nothing at the same time," she said, "like you forgot which thing you were supposed to be looking at." Sojun stared at her. "That's what lost means," Amara said simply. "When you don't know which way to go." The waiter refilled Naomi's tea. The music shifted, something instrumental, strings over a low piano line. At the table behind them, a couple laughed at something private, and the laugh was brief and warm and entirely meaningless, and somehow unbearable. "How long have you been in Seoul?" Seojun asked Naomi, recalibrating, moving to safer ground. 18 months, like I said. Family here?" "I don't have family anywhere particularly." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, the way you stated a weather condition. "My parents passed when I was in my mid-20s, some cousins back in Baltimore. It's mostly us." A glance at Amara. "Which is plenty." "Plenty and a half," Amara said, which was apparently a reference to some private accounting system between them. Seojun thought about the men downstairs maintaining his perimeter. Doyeon waiting for a return call. The 12 people on his direct security payroll, and the 40 more in adjacent layers and the hundreds beyond that through the organization's various tiers. He was never technically alone. He had not been genuinely alone since he was 22 years old. He could not remember the last time that had mattered in either direction. "And you?" Naomi asked. "Family?" No. She didn't push it, didn't offer the usual social lubricant. The half-sympathetic tilt of the head, the murmured acknowledgement designed to smooth over the absence of something. She received the word and set it down. He appreciated that without knowing why he appreciated it. "There's a younger sister," he said, after a pause that surprised him. "Somewhere. We haven't spoken in 9 years. That's a long time. Yes. Is that by choice? By consequence?" He turned his water glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth. "Some choices make other things unavoidable." Naomi looked at him steadily. "Sure," she said. "That's true." She didn't ask what choices, she didn't speculate. She filed it in the same quiet way she seemed to file most things. Not forgotten, not overweighted, just placed somewhere careful. It occurred to him, sitting in this restaurant he had never intended to enter on a night he hadn't planned to spend this way, that she was possibly the most self-possessed person he had sat across from in years. He dealt regularly with men who commanded armies and owned senators, and they maneuvered the way all powerful people maneuvered, with the specific restlessness of those who were always positioning, always angling, always trying to make the current moment into a better future moment. Naomi Johnson was doing nothing of the kind. She was simply here, in this room, eating her meal, watching her daughter build things out of noodles, and talking to a stranger who had shown up uninvited at her table. The simplicity of it was, in a way he couldn't entirely articulate, almost violent. He asked Amara about the noodle structure. This was not a decision he was aware of making. The question simply came out, and Amara looked up with the particular brightness of a child who has been genuinely asked something. "It's the Han River Bridge," she said immediately. This part is the suspension cables. I'm trying to figure out if the noodles are strong enough to hold the upper deck. She indicated with her spoon a horizontal noodle balanced precariously across two vertical ones. It keeps collapsing. You need more contact surface at the joints, he said. Amar looked at him with renewed attention. You know about bridges? I know about structures. He reached across without fanfare and demonstrated, taking the horizontal noodle and pressing it slightly deeper into the upright ones, creating more friction. Weight distribution. You want the load to push down, not out. Amara studied this with the focused seriousness of an engineer confronted with new data. She tested the joint carefully with one finger. It held. Her eyes went wide. Okay, she said. Okay, that's good. Do you know about actual bridges? I've built a few. Through contractors. Were they good? They're still standing. That's the main thing, Amara said, nodding with the gravity of a professional, and returned to her structure with renewed energy. Naomi was watching him. He caught her expression and could not immediately read it. Not the wariness from earlier, not warmth exactly, something more provisional than warmth, like watching someone do something you hadn't expected and not yet being certain what it meant. You're good with kids, she said. I've never spent time with children. That's not what I said. She tilted her head slightly. I said you're good with her. You treated her question like it was worth answering. It was. You'd be surprised how many adults don't operate that way. Her voice was dry, not bitter. The observation of someone who had documented something over years and was simply reporting it. Seojun had no response. He thought about the men in his organization who did not meet his eyes in meetings and who presented information with the careful pre-editing of people who had learned that certain responses produce certain consequences. He thought about the politicians who smiled at him across dinner tables while sweating through their shirts. He thought about the men he had grown up with in the neighborhoods east of Mapo, where money was scarce and ambition was the only available currency, and how none of them had produced anyone easy to simply sit across from. The clock above the bar showed 11:43. He should leave. There was no rational reason for him to still be here. Do-yeon needed a response about Prosecutor Lim. The Incheon accounts were a time-sensitive issue. There were 17 other items on his mental calendar for the next 48 hours, and none of them were in this room. He looked at Amara's bridge, which now spanned the full width of her dinner plate, with a structural integrity that had genuinely improved. He looked at the Han River through the window, black and wide and cold. He looked at Naomi, who was watching the city and not him, her tea cooling in her hands, her expression quiet and unguarded in the way faces became when they believed no one was paying attention. He stayed. The clock moved. 11:50, 11:55. Around them, the restaurant began to shift in the way restaurants shifted near midnight on New Year's Eve. Servers moving with slightly less precision, conversations loosening, the low cumulative pressure of anticipated celebration making the air feel different, thicker, and more electric at once. Amara had abandoned her bridge and was now kneeling on her chair, face pressed close to the window, watching the river. The fireworks are going to come from over there, she announced, pointing southeast with certainty. The man at the front said so. He said approximately over there, Naomi said. Same thing. Naomi looked at Seojun with an expression that said clearly this was a pattern she had stopped trying to interrupt. He understood without being told that Amara was not wrong about the fireworks, and that Naomi knew this, and that the gentle correction was more about principle than accuracy. What are you doing tomorrow? Amara asked him, turning from the window. The question arrived with the casual directness she applied to everything, as if the answer mattered and the asking of it required no special justification. Seojun paused. I have meetings, he said. On New Year's Day. My work doesn't observe holidays. Amara turned this over. That's sad, she said, not cruelly. She stated it the same way she stated everything, as an observation. New Year's Day is for resting. You're supposed to start slow so you have room to go fast later. Amara's full of theories about pacing, Naomi said. They're not theories, they're facts, Amara said. My teacher, Mr. Beck, says the same thing. Seojun looked at this child, this small, fearless, deeply certain person in a pink dress with a grass stain on the hem, and felt something move in his chest that he could not name and did not try to. It was not sentiment exactly. It was closer to the sensation of recognizing something you had lost so long ago you had stopped looking for it. Naomi stood. I need to find the restroom, she said, and looked at Seojun with a directness that was deliberate and measured. You'll stay with her for 2 minutes? He understood what the question actually was. He understood the weight of it. The specific trust embedded in a mother asking a stranger to sit with her child. The degree of assessment required for that trust to be extended. The fact that it was being extended at all. Yes, he said. Naomi held his gaze for one additional second. Then she left. Amara watched her mother go, then turned back to Seojun with the untroubled equanimity of a child who had not been concerned in the first place. She checked you, Amara said. Seojun raised an eyebrow. She does that. Amara picked up her spoon and turned it over in her fingers. When she wants to know if someone is actually safe, or just seems safe, she leaves and sees what happens. And what happens? Amara shrugged. Usually nothing. You can tell a lot about people from nothing. He stared at her. 8 years old. Where did you learn that? From her. The answer was immediate, matter of fact. She says the loudest thing a person says is what they do when no one is looking. Seojun sat with that for a moment. Outside, the fireworks had begun in earnest now. Not the isolated early rockets from before, but the organized cascade of the official display rising above the Han River in clusters of gold and blue and white, the concussions reaching the glass a half-second after the light. The restaurant erupted, chairs scraped, glasses clinked. The room pressed toward the windows and the noise rose up from something ambient into something full-bodied and immediate. Amara pressed her nose to the glass again, eyes enormous. Seojun watched her. He was aware in that moment of every exit, every figure in the room, the exact position of his 3 men downstairs, Do-hyun's voice waiting in his coat pocket with 11 unanswered messages. He was aware of all of it, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, it occupied only the outer edge of his attention. The center of his attention was a child watching fireworks. Naomi reappeared at his left shoulder, quiet in her return, and stood beside him rather than moving back to her chair because there was no better view of the river from the chair. 10 seconds, Amar said, her breath fogging the glass. She had begun counting down from some internal reading she was confident about. 9. 8. Seojun stood. The 3 of them were standing now, facing the window, facing Seoul and the river and the fireworks, painting everything in colors that had no useful name in any language he spoke. Not gold, not white, something between those, something that lived in the eye for a half-second after the explosion and then was gone. 3, Amara said. 2. 1. The room exploded. The fireworks outside synchronized into a cascading finale, the Han River reflecting it back and doubling everything. The sky and the water both burning with the same impossible light. People were cheering, embracing, pouring champagne, and the sound was enormous and warm and entirely foreign to him. This sound of collective joy. This sound of people choosing to be together. Seojun stood still in the middle of it. Something was happening to him that he could not stop and did not know the word for. His hands, which had signed documents ordering men's destruction and which had never once shaken when they should have, were not entirely steady. Amara turned from the window, cheeks flushed, a balloon string in her hand that a waiter had pressed upon her at the stroke of midnight, silver, star-shaped, floating 6 inches above her head. She looked at Seojun with an expression that was simply happy, purely and without complication happy, and held the balloon string out to him. He stared at it. "You should take it," she said. "Why?" She tilted her head, thinking about it the way she thought about everything. Seriously, without performance. "So you'll remember," she said, "that you were here, that tonight happened. Sometimes people forget the good nights because they don't have anything to hold." He looked at the silver star balloon turning slowly above her outstretched hand. The noise of the room was still enormous. Naomi stood slightly behind him and to the left, and he was aware of her presence, the way he was aware of temperature. Not always consciously, but continuously. He was aware that she was watching him. He was aware that something was being decided by whatever he did in the next 5 seconds. His hand moved before he thought about it. He took the balloon string. It was thin and plastic and cold from being near the window, and the balloon itself bumped gently against the ceiling above him, and he stood there. Seojun Kang, the man who had turned half of Seoul into an instrument of his will, who had never in 20 years of absolute authority permitted himself to be moved by anything that didn't serve a purpose. And he stood there with a silver star balloon on New Year's Eve and felt something crack open behind his sternum that he was not ready for and did not know how to close. Amara smiled. "Happy New Year, Mr. Seojun," she said. He opened his mouth, But before he could speak, his coat pocket vibrated 3 times in rapid sequence. Not the ordinary pulse of a message, but the emergency pattern. The one Do-yeon used only when something could not wait. The one that had preceded every crisis his organization had faced in the last decade. He pulled the phone out. The screen showed one line of text. His blood went cold. He read it again to make certain he had read it correctly. He had. Naomi beside him felt the shift in his body before she could have named what changed. The particular quality of stillness that isn't peace, but its precise opposite. A predator going motionless before it moves. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Seo-jun looked up from the phone. His face had changed completely. The thing that had been building in him across this evening, the warmth, the unfamiliar loosening, the sensation of being almost human again, was still there somewhere. He could feel it, but it had been pushed to the very back by something colder and older and far more practiced. He looked at Amara, who was watching him with the steady attention she brought to everything. Then he looked at Naomi. "I have to go," he said. Naomi read his face. She had been reading people for a long time, across a dozen countries and several languages, and whatever she read in his face in that moment made her go very still. "Okay," she said. Just that. No demand for explanation, no performance of concern, just the word, clean and direct, the same quality she brought to everything. He set the balloon string down on the table. The star drifted upward until it pressed against the ceiling. He buttoned his coat. He looked once more at Amara, who had not stopped watching him, and who said nothing, and whose silence was somehow the most complicated thing in the room. Then he walked out. In the elevator going down, the phone showed the message again and again. His mind processed what it meant, and the calculations were automatic and brutal and 20 years deep. He had done this 1,000 times, isolated the problem, identified the options, moved toward the solution with the efficiency of a mechanism built for exactly this purpose. The doors opened at the ground floor. Do-hyun was already there, coat on, face flat, with the controlled neutrality of someone transmitting very bad news in a very public place. Behind him, 2 of the security team flanked the exit. "Tell me," Seo-jun said. Do-hyun leaned close, spoke 3 sentences. Seo-jun listened. The lobby was full of people in their New Year's finest, laughing and moving in clusters toward the exit and the cold and the rest of the night. Music floated down from the restaurant above. Somewhere up there, a silver star balloon pressed against a ceiling, and a little girl was watching fireworks, and a woman with steady brown eyes was drinking her tea. Seo-jun thought of none of this. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Maybe 6 hours, Do-hyun said. "Maybe less." Seo-jun nodded once, the way he had nodded 1,000 times before. Not agreement, not acceptance, just the mechanical acknowledgement of a problem that required immediate action and would receive it. He walked toward the exit. He was 3 steps from the door when he stopped. He did not turn around. He stood there for 2 full seconds, which was, for Seo-jun Kang, an eternity. Something about a silver star balloon pressing against a ceiling. Something about a child who spoke to him as if he were simply a person who had gotten temporarily lost. He turned around. "Get me a car at the back entrance," he said to Do-hyun. 2 minutes. Do-hyun stared at him. "Sir, the timeline—" 2 minutes, Seo-jun said. "Then we move." He went back to the elevator. He went back up to the 22nd floor. He did not fully know why. That was the part that frightened him more than any message on any phone. The elevator doors opened. He stepped out into the warmth and the music and the amber light of Cheongsu, and he could see their table from here, and Amara was looking at her mother and laughing at something. And the silver star was still there at the ceiling, and Naomi had her back to him. But even from this distance and from behind, he could see the particular set of her shoulders that he had been reading without meaning to all evening. And then Naomi turned. She saw him. Her face did something he couldn't fully read, and across 15 feet of restaurant floor, through all the noise and the New Year's warmth and the complications of everything he was and everything she didn't yet know he was, they looked at each other. He crossed the room. He crouched beside Amara's chair. The little girl turned to him with no surprise at all, as if she had expected him to come back, as if it had only been a question of when. He reached into his coat pocket and set an envelope on the table. Enough to cover the meal, enough to cover a month of meals, and it didn't matter because that wasn't what he was there to say. "I don't have much time," he said, "but I wanted—" He stopped. The words were not organized. He was not accustomed to words that were not organized. "I wanted to tell you, both of you." His jaw was tight. "This was a good night," Amar said simply. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. He stood. He looked at Naomi, who was watching him with those steady eyes and that particular quality of attention that asked nothing and received everything. "The balloon," Naomi said quietly, nodding toward the ceiling. He looked up, the silver star. "She said you should have it," Naomi said, "so you don't forget." He stood there for one more second. Then he reached up and took the balloon string from the ceiling, where it had drifted after he'd set it down, and he held it at his side. And he looked ridiculous, a man like him, and he absolutely did not care. He walked toward the elevator. Do-hyun was waiting. Outside, Seoul was still burning with its New Year's light. But the message on the phone was still there, and the crisis it announced was still real, and the 6 hours were already closer to 5, and whatever had just happened in that restaurant, whatever that warmth was, whatever those two people had briefly unlocked in him, it was going to have to survive the next several hours of what his life actually was. And for the first time, standing in an elevator with a silver star balloon and a phone full of very bad news, Seo Jin-kang was not entirely sure it would. The car was black, and it moved through Seoul the way his cars always moved. Fast, quiet, slightly above the speed that ordinary people used, as if the laws of the road were suggestions extended to others and not to him. Do-yeon sat in the front passenger seat. 2 other men flanked Seo-jun in the back. The silver star balloon was not in the car. He had left it at the entrance of the tower with a doorman who had looked at it with profound uncertainty, and Seo-jun had not looked back. The phone showed the message again. 3 words. Cheong is dead. Prosecutor Lim had wanted a meeting tonight about the Incheon accounts. Seo-jun had told Do-hyun to tell him tonight didn't exist. And sometime between that refusal and midnight, Prosecutor Lim had apparently decided to resolve the situation through a different channel, because the body of director Cheong Man-soo, the man who had been quietly laundering money through the Incheon Port Authority for 7 years and who knew more about Seo-jun's financial architecture than almost anyone alive, had been found in a parking structure in Mapo with 2 holes in his chest and his phone wiped clean. "Who found him?" Seo-jun said. "Anonymous tip to the police." Do-hyun's voice was flat. "Call came in at 11:58, 2 minutes before midnight. Timed. Yes. Lim." That would be my read. Seo-jun looked out the window. The streets were still full. The celebration hadn't broken yet. People spilling off curbs, couples walking arm in arm through the cold, with the particular looseness of people who had been drinking since 10 and intended to keep going. His car moved through them without stopping, the driver navigating with the practiced calm of someone who had done this in much worse circumstances. "Cheong kept records," Seo-jun said. "He did. Digital. And physical. You know how he was?" Seo-jun knew how he was. Cheong Man-soo had been 63 years old and had grown up in an era when you didn't trust computers because computers could be hacked and paper could be burned, and a man who held both was a man who couldn't be entirely eliminated. He had kept ledgers, actual paper ledgers, written in a private shorthand that only he fully understood, in a location that Seo-jun knew and 3 other people knew, and nobody outside that circle was supposed to know. "The safe house in Yongsan," Seo-jun said. "Already sent Jinwoo and Park." "When?" 20 minutes ago. They're 10 minutes out." Seo-jun did the arithmetic. The anonymous tip had come in at 11:58. Police response time on New Year's Eve, with half the department on crowd control, would be slow. 40 minutes minimum before anyone senior enough to understand what they were looking at arrived at the scene. That bought time. The question was whether whoever had put 2 holes in Cheong had also known about Yongsan, and if so, how far ahead of him they were. "Who else knew about the ledgers?" he asked. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. This was not the quiet of someone who didn't know the answer. It was the quiet of someone who knew the answer and was deciding how to deliver it. "Do-yeon. Cheong told me there was a conversation, about 3 months ago, with Baek Jun-ho." Seo-jun's jaw tightened. Baek Jun-ho. Cheong didn't think it was significant at the time. Baek asked about the Incheon structure. He said he was asking because he was worried about exposure on the Port Authority contracts if the government changed their infrastructure priorities. Cheong said he showed him the general framework, not the details. But Baek is not a man who needs details shown to him. He extrapolates. "Yes." Seo-jun looked at his hands in the dark of the back seat. Baek Jun-ho was 46, second-generation money, legitimately wealthy from a technology holding company his father had built, and he had expanded with the specific ruthless efficiency of someone who had watched a parent work too hard for too long and intended to do the same work in a fraction of the time. He had been a peripheral associate for 4 years, not inside the organization, not an employee, but a man who used certain services and provided certain access in return, the kind of relationship that existed in the spaces between legitimate business and everything else. Seo-jun had never fully trusted him. He had used him because Baek was useful, and because the information asymmetry between them had always seemed sufficient insurance. 3 months ago, apparently, that asymmetry had shifted. "Where's Baek tonight?" Seo-jun asked. "His New Year's party, Hanam Dong, 300 guests. Of course." He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. "Get me a line to Prosecutor Lim." Do-hyun turned in the seat to look at him directly. This was unusual. Do-hyun did not turn to look at him directly unless what he was about to say required the weight of eye contact to be taken seriously. "Boss, reaching out to Lim tonight, directly, puts your fingerprints on a situation that currently has none of your fingerprints on it. Chang's death puts my fingerprints on it, whether I call Lim or not. The question is whether I find out what Lim knows before or after, he decides what to do with what he knows. And if Lim is the one who ordered Chang, then calling him tells me that too." Seo-jun's voice was level. Not calm, level. There was a difference, and anyone who had worked around him long enough understood it. Calm was an absence of tension. Level was tension held so tight it stopped moving. "Get me the line." Do-hyun got him the line. It rang 4 times. 5. Then, "Seo-jun, see." Prosecutor Lim's voice was precise and careful in the way of a man who had received a call he was expecting and had prepared for. The background noise behind him suggested a party. Not Beck's scale, something more modest, government adjacent. "Happy New Year." "You wanted a meeting," Seo-jun said. "I did. You declined." "I'm undeclining. Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., you pick the location." A brief pause. The kind of pause that wasn't uncertainty, but was performing it. "That's very accommodating of you, given the hour." "I'm a flexible man." "Yes." Another pause. "I heard there was an incident in Mapo." "I heard that too." "Unfortunate." "Very." The words sat between them in the phone line for 2 full seconds, doing everything words weren't saying. 7 a.m., Lim said. "The coffee place on Bukchon, you know it." "I'll find it." He ended the call. Do-hyun was watching him. "Lim didn't order it," Seo-jun said. "How do you know?" "Because if Lim had ordered it, he wouldn't have called me to meet about the accounts. He would have used the accounts directly, taken whatever Chang gave him, and moved without warning. The call was Lim trying to get ahead of something, not control something he already had." He looked at the city moving past the window. "Lim is scared. Someone used his information without his authorization, and now he's exposed and he wants to know if I know it was him." "Was it him?" "The information, maybe. The action, no." He turned it over. "Baek." Do-hyun said nothing. Baek got the framework from Cheong. Baek knows Lim has been collecting on the Incheon accounts. Baek lets Lim believe he's building a case, feeds him enough to make the meeting request feel urgent, watches Lim push, watches me push back, and then removes Chong before either of us can figure out who's actually running the play. Seo-jun's voice was quiet. "It's clean. It's Baek." "If you're right," Do-hyun said carefully, "then Baek has already moved against you. Tonight. On the night you were—" He stopped. "On the night I was where I was." "Yes." Seo-jun's voice didn't change. "Say it." "You were unreachable for almost 2 hours, boss. That's not normal." "No." "The men were maintaining position, but nobody had eyes on you directly. If something had happened, nothing happened. This time. The car went quiet. Outside, the celebration continued in total ignorance of the conversation happening inside the black car moving through it. A group of young people stumbled past a crosswalk, laughing, one of them wearing a hat that said Happy New Year in 3 languages. The driver slowed and let them pass and then accelerated again, smooth and unhesitating. Seo-jun looked at Do-hyun. "Say what you actually want to say." Do-hyun faced forward again. His neck was stiff. "I want to say that a restaurant on the 22nd floor with civilian exposure is not a controlled environment, and that the 2 hours prior represent a gap that I can't fill in our security log, and that if you're going to take gaps like that, I need to know in advance so I can compensate. A beat. Sir? That's not what you want to say? A longer pause. No. So say it. Do-yeon's jaw worked slightly. 11 years. The man had been with him 11 years, and in those 11 years had never once spoken outside his operational lane. And whatever he was about to say now was costing him something. Seo-jun could see that clearly, the physical cost of it in the set of his shoulders. Who were they? Do-hyun asked. Seo-jun said nothing. The woman. The child. Do-hyun kept his eyes forward. I had eyes on you from the lobby. I saw you go back up. The silence in the car was a specific kind. Not comfortable, not hostile, just weighted with the particular tension of something that had been named that both people would have preferred remain unnamed. Nobody, Seo-jun said. They were nobody. Do-hyun nodded once. He didn't believe it. Seo-jun knew he didn't believe it, and Do-hyun knew that Seo-jun knew, and neither of them said anything further about it because there was nothing further to say that wouldn't make everything more complicated than it currently was, which was already very complicated. The phone rang. Jin-woo, from Yongsan. Seo-jun answered. The safe house is clean, Jin-woo said. He was breathing slightly hard, which meant he'd been moving fast. Nobody's been here. The ledgers are where they're supposed to be. Take them, everything, the primary set and the copies. Already in the bag. Get them to the Mapo office. Not the main building. The secondary unit on the 4th floor. You know the one. Yes, sir. And Jin-woo. Seo-jun kept his voice level. If anyone followed you there, I need to know before you move, not after. A pause. Understood. He ended the call. The car was pulling into the parking structure beneath his office building in Jung-gu, a steel and concrete tower that housed, on its upper floors, the legitimate corporate headquarters of 3 different holding companies, and, on its lower floors, the actual apparatus of how Seo-jun's world ran. The security here was thorough and invisible, and had not been breached in 8 years. He got out of the car. The underground structure was cold and fluorescent, and smelled of exhaust and concrete, and the particular mineral sharpness of a sealed space that processed a lot of moving vehicles. 2 more of his men were already waiting near the elevator. They fell into position without being told. They knew their positions the way furniture knew its place in a room, by long habit, and the specific gravity of expectation. I want Baek Junho's financial records from the last 6 months, Seo-jun said as they moved toward the elevator. Everything we have access to, corporate accounts, personal accounts, the Singapore entity, the Jeju Property Trust, all of it. By when? Do-hyun said. By 4 a.m. It's 12:40. I know what time it is. The elevator opened. They rode up in silence. Seo-jun's reflection in the brushed steel doors was fractured, a distorted geometry of himself. Unrecognizable in the specific way that distortions always made recognizable things strange. The office was empty except for 2 people who were never not there. Min, his analyst, a 29-year-old woman who had come from a financial crimes prosecution background and who had understood, within approximately 1 month of joining him, exactly what she had joined and had made her decision to stay with the calm finality of someone who had looked at 2 roads and chosen and did not look back. And Ro, his legal architect, who was 61 and had the colorless, meticulous energy of someone who had spent 4 decades making illegal things look legal and was very good at it and had stopped caring about the distinction sometime in his late 40s. They were both at their stations when he walked in. Min had 3 screens active. Ro had paper, actual paper, a legal pad, covered in his small, precise handwriting. Cheong, Seo-jun said to both of them. The ledgers will be the primary exposure, Ro said without looking up from his pad. If the shorthand holds, and it should, Cheong was careful, then even a sophisticated reader can't reconstruct the full picture without the cipher. We have the cipher. Baek Junho might have it. Ro looked up. Something moved behind his eyes. That would change the analysis. Assume he does. What does he have? Ro set down his pen with the deliberateness of a man reordering his thinking. With the cipher and the general framework Cheong allegedly shared, approximately 60% of the Incheon structure. Enough to identify the major flows, not enough to trace the terminus accounts without significant additional work. How much work? For someone with Baek's resources? Ro was quiet for 4 seconds. Seo-jun counted them. 3 weeks. Maybe 2. If he has forensic accounting support, that's better than what I'm imagining. He has better, Min said. She was looking at one of her screens. Beck acquired a financial investigation firm in Singapore 14 months ago. I flagged it at the time as potentially significant, and nobody moved on it. Seo Jun looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, which was one of the things he valued about her. I noted it in the monthly report. It didn't get prioritized. Who reviews the monthly reports? The question landed in the room, and everyone in the room knew the answer, and nobody said it because the answer was Cheong Man Soo, and Cheong Man Soo had apparently been having conversations with Baek Junho 3 months ago. And the picture this assembled was one that Seojun was not yet ready to say aloud because saying it aloud would make it true in a different way than it was currently true, which was true in a cold and nauseating way somewhere below his sternum. Chong had not simply been killed. Chong had possibly been turned. Seojun walked to the window. The city was still visible from here. Lower down than Cheongsu, a different angle, more concrete and infrastructure, and less of the river's dark expanse. He stood with his back to the room and looked at it. Behind him, Min and Ro waited. Do-yeon waited. The 2 security men near the door were statues. Chung worked for me for 19 years, Sojun said. He was not talking to any of them specifically. His voice was quiet enough that they had to hold still to hear it. Before that, he worked for my predecessor. He built the Incheon structure from nothing. He created the shorthand cipher himself so that he was the only fully legible one. A pause. Why would Baek need the cipher if Chong was already cooperating? Silence. He wouldn't, Min said carefully. No. Seojun turned from the window. His face had settled into something flat and very cold. Chong wasn't turned. Chong was used. His conversation with Baek 3 months ago, however Baek engineered it, gave Baek the framework. Chong probably didn't even know what he'd given away. Then Baek built from there independently, using the Singapore firm, and Chong, who had no idea how much Baek had already reconstructed, Chong became a liability, a loose thread with full knowledge and nothing to gain from keeping quiet. So Baek removed him, Do-hyun said, before Chong could figure out what had been taken from him and come to me. Seojun moved to the main conference table and sat down. Not the head. The side, which was where he sat when he was thinking rather than commanding. Chong would have come to me, if he'd realized. He would have come to me first. The room absorbed this. Ro picked up his pen. The question then becomes what Baek wants. What Baek wants, Seojun said, is what everyone eventually wants. Leverage. Not to destroy me. If he wanted to destroy me, he'd have gone to the prosecutors directly already, and he hasn't. He wants to sit across from me with something in his hand that I can't take away from him and renegotiate every agreement we've ever had from a position of strength. When? Do-yeon asked. He'll let me find Chong. Let me spend tonight running. Let me feel the ground shifting under me. Then he'll call. Seojun looked at his hands on the table. Probably tomorrow. And if you're wrong, Ro said. If I'm wrong, we find out at 7 a.m. when I meet Lim, and Lim tells me something that changes the picture. He looked at Ro. Build me a containment scenario. If Baek has 60% and moves to complete it, what can we seal and how fast? Ro was already writing. Seojun looked at Min. The Singapore firm. Who's the lead analyst there? Man named Ferraro, Italian trained, formerly with a European private equity forensics group. Very good. Find out if he's been activated in the last 30 days. I'll need to go around some firewalls. Then go around them. Min turned back to her screens without further comment. Sojun sat at the table in the fluorescent quiet of the office and listened to the sound of his organization working. Keyboard clicks, the low murmur of Do-yeon coordinating on a secondary phone, the scratch of Ro's pen, and felt the night arranging itself around him in its actual shape, which was not the shape it had been for the 2 hours he had spent in a restaurant that overlooked the Han River. His phone showed 1:47 a.m. He thought about Amara saying, New Year's Day is for resting. You're supposed to start slow so you have room to go fast later. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called the one person he had not yet called and should have called first. It rang twice. I was wondering when you'd call. The voice was a woman's, older, dry in the specific way of someone who had been dry since before it became a style. Her name was Director Yoon Chang-suk, and she was 67 years old, and she ran the Financial Intelligence Unit within the National Prosecution Service, with the meticulous ferocity of someone who had spent 4 decades watching powerful men make the same kinds of mistakes and had documented all of them. She was also the only government official in Seoul who had a channel to Seo-jun that went in both directions. "You heard," he said. "I heard 3 hours ago. I was waiting for you to stop doing whatever you were doing and call me." He did not respond to that. "What do you know about Baek Junho's movements in the last quarter?" "I know things about Baek Junho's movements that would make your evening considerably worse than it currently is." "Tell me." A pause. Not hesitation. Director Yoon did not hesitate. This was the pause of someone selecting which truth to deploy first. "Baek Junho met with a representative of the Ha Group in Busan," she said. 6 weeks ago. Privately. The Ha Group, as you know, has been trying to move into the Port Authority logistics space for 3 years and has been unable to do so because of the existing contracts that protect your Incheon position." Another pause. "The meeting was 2 hours long." The Ha Group. The Kim Syndicate's successor organization in the South, rebranded and restructured after the war 5 years ago, led by a woman named Ha Soo-yeon, who was 44 years old and had rebuilt from rubble with a patience and intelligence that Seo-jun had been monitoring with the specific attention he paid to things that could eventually become dangerous. He had been wrong about eventually. "Baek isn't building leverage to renegotiate," Seo-jun said. His voice was very quiet now. "He's building a case to hand to Ha Soo-yeon so she can take the Incheon position when I'm removed." "That is my current assessment, yes," Director Yoon said. "I thought you'd want to know." "When were you going to tell me?" "Tonight, as it happens. Your man declined the meeting on your behalf." The silence that followed was thick with everything that Seo-jun did not say about the decision to decline that meeting and what he had been doing instead. "What do you need from me?" Yoon asked. "Time." "How much?" 72 hours. She exhaled. "I can give you 36. After 36, the Chung investigation reaches a level in the chain where I don't control the pace anymore. You understand?" "I understand." "Seo-jun, see?" Her voice dropped a register, went drier still, the way it did when she was about to say something she considered important and wanted him to weight it correctly. "Whatever you do in the next 36 hours, be surgical. I've kept your name out of rooms for 15 years. I cannot do that if you make noise." "I'm always surgical." "You were surgical," she said. "You've been distracted lately. People notice distraction." He said nothing. "Happy New Year," she said, and ended the call. He set the phone on the table. Min looked up from her screens. Her face was carefully neutral, which was the face she made when the information she had found was not neutral at all. "Ferraro," she said. "The Singapore analyst. He's been active." "How active?" "His system accessed the Port Authority contract database 41 times in the last 22 days. She paused. "He has a complete map of the Incheon structure. I found the output file. It's been compiled and packaged." Another pause. "It was transmitted to a Seoul address 6 hours ago." 6 hours ago. While Seo-jun was standing on a bridge watching a red balloon escape into the dark above Yoido. "Whose address?" he asked. Min turned one of her screens to face him. He read the address. He read it again. The address belonged to a private office suite in Gangnam, registered to a consulting firm that did not exist. The firm had been incorporated 11 months ago using a nominee director. The nominee director was a woman named Park Ji-hye, who was 41 years old and who had worked, before her abrupt resignation 8 months ago, as a senior intelligence coordinator for the National Prosecution Service. She had worked directly under Director Yoon Chang-suk. The room did not change. The fluorescent lights were still the same fluorescent lights. Ro's pen was still moving on the paper. Do-yeon was still at the far wall. Everything was exactly as it had been 15 seconds ago. But everything was different, and Seo-jun felt the difference move through him the way cold water moved through a system. Fast, total, reaching every corner. Director Yoon had not offered him 36 hours because she wanted to help him. She had offered him 36 hours because she needed 36 hours for something. "Do-yeon," Seo-jun said. His voice had gone to a register that everyone in the room recognized, and none of them liked hearing. "Get me a car. Not this building's garage. The secondary lot on Togyo. Now?" "Right now." He stood. "And call Jinwoo. Tell him not to bring those ledgers to the Mapo office." "Where then?" Seo-jun was already moving toward the door. "Tell him to keep driving. I'll call him with a location." He was in the corridor, moving fast, Do-yeon 2 steps behind him, when his personal phone, not the organizational line, not the security channel, but the private number that fewer than 6 people in the world possessed, vibrated in his chest pocket. He stopped. He looked at the screen. The number was one he knew and had not seen in 9 years. His younger sister. He stood in the corridor of his office building at 2:11 in the morning on New Year's Day with Do-hyun waiting behind him and Jin-woo driving in circles with ledgers in a bag, and director Yoon somewhere across the city doing something he didn't yet fully understand, and Baek Junho at a party in Hanam-dong, probably sleeping comfortably through all of it. And his younger sister was calling him for the first time in 9 years. His thumb hovered over the screen. There was no version of this that was a coincidence. He answered. He answered on the third vibration. Ji-yeon, he said. Silence on the line. Not dead silence. He could hear her breathing, shallow and slightly uneven, the breath of someone who had rehearsed this call many times and was discovering that rehearsal hadn't prepared them for the actual moment of it. Oppa. Her voice was lower than he remembered. 9 years did that. She had been 26 when he last heard it, bright and angry and cracking at the edges, and now it was something harder, more settled, the voice of a person who had finished becoming whoever the intervening years had made her. Don't hang up. I'm not hanging up. I need you to listen to me before you say anything. Ji-yeon, please. The word came out stripped of everything except what it was. Not performance, not manipulation, just the word itself, naked and exhausted. Just listen. You can be angry after. Just listen first. He looked at Do-hyun, who was standing 2 meters behind him in the corridor with the disciplined blankness of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds were not for him. Seo-jun turned away and put his back to the wall and looked at the far end of the corridor, which ended in a fire door painted the specific institutional gray of things that existed for emergencies and were otherwise ignored. Talk, he said. She talked. It took 4 minutes. He did not interrupt her. He listened the way he listened in rooms where the information being given to him was the kind that could not be half received. Totally, with every layer of his attention, filtering and processing and building the picture as each sentence added to it. When she finished, the corridor was very quiet. How long, he said, have you known Baek Junho? A pause that told him the answer before she gave it. 3 years. You were introduced. Yes. By whom? Oppa, that's not the... By whom, Ji-yeon? Her breath caught. Director Yoon, she said. He closed his eyes, opened them. The fire door at the end of the corridor was exactly the same gray it had been 4 minutes ago. Director Yoon introduced you to Baek Junho 3 years ago. She said he was a business contact, someone who could help me. I had the consulting practice. I was trying to build something that wasn't connected to you, that was mine. And she said he was someone who respected discretion and needed the kind of work I was doing. And she stopped. He could hear her pressing on something, some internal mechanism that was about to give way. I didn't know what he was building, Seo-jun. I didn't know until 2 weeks ago. What happened 2 weeks ago? He told me. Her voice went flat with something he recognized as the particular quality of a shock that had been lived with long enough to calcify into a kind of awful steadiness. He sat across from me in my office, and he laid it out. What he had. What he was going to do with it. And then he told me what he needed me to do. What did he need you to do? She was quiet. Ji-yeon. He needed me to call you, she said. Tonight. He said you'd be in the middle of something. He said there would be a situation tonight that would have you moving fast, and that if I called you in the middle of it, you'd come to me. He said you'd come in person because you wouldn't trust a phone line for what I had to tell you. Another pause. Shorter. He was right, wasn't he? You're already thinking about coming. Seo-jun stood against the wall and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow and controlled, the kind of breathing you learned when you were very young and the world was already requiring you to be larger than you were, and you discovered that the only thing you could absolutely control was the rhythm of your own body. Baek Junho had designed this, not just tonight, not just the Chong killing, or the Singapore data transfer, or the meeting with Ha Soo-yeon in Busan. All of it, including this moment, including the phone in Seo-jun's hand and his sister's voice on the line, had been designed, laid out in sequence. Seo-jun had been walking through a constructed corridor for months, possibly longer, and every turn had been where Baek expected it to be. Where are you right now? He asked. My apartment. Mapo. Are you alone? A pause. There's a man in the hallway outside my door. He's been there since 11 tonight. He's not mine. Does he know you called me? Beck told me to call you, so yes. So the call was monitored, which meant Bayek knew he was standing in this corridor right now, which meant the car on Togier Row, the secondary lot, the deviation from the expected route. Beck had anticipated deviations. The whole point of using Gion was to reorient him, to give him a destination that his instincts would override his operational planning to reach. Beck wanted him to go to Mapo. Listen to me carefully, Seojun said. He kept his voice very even, the way you kept a blade very still when you were close to something important. I want you to go to your bathroom, lock the door. Do not open it for anyone until I tell you to. Do you understand? Seojun, if you don't come, do you understand me? Yes. Small. Certain. Stay on the phone. He turned to Do-hyun, covered the mouthpiece, spoke in a fast, low sequence. Get Min on the line. I need the location of every vehicle registered to Baek Joon-ho's personal holdings within 2 kilometers of a Mapo residential address I'm going to send you. Do it now, quietly, and do not use the organizational network. Use the secondary channel. And get Ro out of the building through the basement. Do-hyun was already moving. Sojun brought the phone back to his ear. Ji-yeon, the man Baek told you to call tonight, before me. Was there someone else? Silence. I'm not angry, he said. It was, he realized distantly, true. There was no room for anger in the machinery currently running behind his sternum. I need the information. He told me to contact someone in your organization first, she said slowly. Someone who would confirm to him that you were occupied, that you were somewhere he didn't expect. The cold that moved through him this time was different from the cold in the office when Min had turned her screen around. That had been the cold of a picture becoming clear. This was the cold of understanding how long you had been standing in the picture without knowing it. Who in my organization, he said. She gave him a name. He stood with the name in his ear for 3 full seconds. The name was Do-hyun. Seojun did not move. He was aware of Do-hyun 6 meters away in the corridor, phone to his own ear, executing the instructions Seojun had given him 30 seconds ago. He watched Do-hyun's back. The set of those shoulders. 11 years of those shoulders, always positioned between him and whatever was coming, always exactly where they were supposed to be. He thought about the conversation in the car. You were unreachable for almost 2 hours, boss. The insistence on it. The way Do-hyun had asked about the woman and the child. Not, Seojun understood now, out of professional concern, out of something else, out of the need to know what had changed, what new variable had entered the picture. Whether Seojun had acquired in the 2 hours of his disappearance something that would complicate the simplicity of what was coming. He thought about Do-hyun saying, I'll get you a line to Prosecutor Lim without suggesting an alternative. The smooth, unhesitating efficiency of every transition tonight. Not the efficiency of competence, the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen next because they had helped plan it. Ji-yeon, he said, very quiet. Put the bathroom door between you and the hallway. Right now. He ended the call. He stood in the corridor and looked at Do-hyun's back. 11 years. He walked toward him. Do-hyun heard his footsteps and began to turn. And in the fraction of a second before the turn completed, in the specific quality of that rotation, Seojun saw it. The slight, involuntary tension. The adjustment. The face arriving at its destination a half beat after the body, which was the half beat in which the face had to remember what expression it was supposed to be wearing. Do-hyun met his eyes. Neither of them spoke. The 2 security men near the elevator were watching. They were Do-hyun's selections. They had always been Do-hyun's selections because Do-hyun managed the personal security roster, because Seojun had trusted him to manage it for 11 years. Give me your phone, Seojun said. Do-hyun's expression did not change. That was itself a piece of information. A man who wasn't guilty would have registered confusion. Do-hyun registered nothing, which was the practiced blankness of someone who had prepared for this moment and was executing the preparation. Boss? Your phone. Now. A long 2 seconds, then Do-hyun held it out. Seojun took it. Looked at the recent calls. The last outgoing call, made 40 seconds ago while Seojun had given him instructions, was not to Min. It was to a number he didn't recognize, which lasted 11 seconds, which was long enough to transmit one piece of information and nothing more. He looked up from the phone. "How long?" he said. Do-hyun was quiet. Do-yeon. His voice was flat. Not loud, not cold in the theatrical way, just flat. The specific flatness of something from which all performance had been removed. "How long?" 14 months, Do-hyun said. The number landed in the space between them and sat there. 14 months. 14 months of morning briefings and security logs and car rides, and operational decisions made in Do-yeon's presence. Every significant move in the last 14 months had been made with Do-yeon in the room, or adjacent to the room, or in the car, or on the earpiece. Every strategy, every response, every gap and vulnerability and improvised deviation. The Busan conflict resolution, the Incheon contract renewals, the management of Prosecutor Lim, all of it observed, recorded, transmitted. "What did he give you?" Seo-jun asked. Do-hyun's jaw was set. Whatever he had prepared to feel in this moment, he was feeling it, and he was holding it with the same muscular discipline he applied to everything, which was, Seo-jun recognized grimly, a quality he had selected for. He had built a security apparatus around people who did not crack under pressure. He had apparently selected well in a direction he hadn't intended. "Security for my family," Do-hyun said. "My wife and my son are in Daejeon. They've been... Bayek has people around them for 14 months. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated and more honest than guilt. He approached me after the Busan situation. He knew things about my finances, things I'd done that you didn't know about. He had documentation. He said the choice was cooperation or exposure. A beat. I chose wrong. You chose 14 months ago, Seo-jun said. You're still choosing right now, that call you made 40 seconds ago. Do-hyun said nothing. What did you transmit? The corridor was very still. The two security men near the elevator had not moved, but something in their posture had changed. The subtle reorientation of people who were receiving new information about the geography of the situation they were standing in. Seo-jun registered them in his peripheral vision and did not look directly at them. That you knew, Do-hyun said, that the call from your sister had told you, and you knew. Baek Junho now knew that Seo-jun had identified the leak, that the sequence had been exposed, which meant the next phase, whatever Baek had prepared for the scenario where Seo-jun discovered the architecture before reaching the destination in Mapo, was already being activated. The fire door at the end of the corridor. Seo-jun looked at it. How many men does Baek have outside this building? He asked. Do-hyun's throat moved. I don't know exactly. Estimate? 6. Maybe 8. A pause. The building's systems. He has the building's security feed. Has had it for 3 months. Another pause, smaller, almost unwilling. That was me. 6 to 8 men outside. Security feeds compromised. The secondary lot on Togye-ro, which Seo-jun had specified precisely because it was off the primary route, had been transmitted to Baek along with every other deviation Seo-jun had made or considered making tonight, because Do-hyun had been in every room and every car and every conversation. There was no secondary route. There was no uncompromised exit. There was this corridor and the men in it and a fire door at the end that led to a stairwell that led to a street that Baek Junho's people were currently surrounding. Seo-jun looked at the two security men near the elevator. Which of you is his? He asked. Neither of them moved. I'm going to ask one more time, Seo-jun said. His voice had gone to a register below flat, something underneath flatness, which was the register that people who had worked around him long enough understood meant that the asking was almost finished. Which of you is Baek's man? The one on the left, younger, 28 or so, had been on the roster for 8 months, had been selected by Do-yeon, and whose name was Seo Chan-min, moved his eyes a fraction of a degree toward the elevator button. Not the other man, just Chan-min. Just that tiny, involuntary calculation. Go home, Seo-jun said to him. Right now. Take nothing from this building. Tell Baek I said the same thing I said to Prosecutor Lim. Tonight doesn't exist. He held Chan-min's eyes for 2 seconds. The next version of this conversation will not have a version where you go home. Do you understand me? Chan-min left, fast, without looking at anyone. The other man, Kwon, 7 years on the roster, reliable in ways that Seo-jun now had to re-examine against 14 months of possible contamination, but who had passed the basic test of stillness just now, was watching Seo-jun with the expression of someone trying to recalibrate a situation that had shifted faster than anticipated. Kwon, Seo-jun said, "My sister is in a Mapo apartment. Address coming to you in 30 seconds. Get there before anyone else does, and get her out." He glanced at Do-hyun's phone in his hand, pulled the address from the call log where Ji-yeon's number showed her registered location, and sent it to Kwon's personal device directly. "Go through Yongsan, not the bridge." Kwon went. The corridor was now 3 people, Seo-jun, Do-hyun, and whatever came next. Do-hyun had not moved during any of this. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing it always did under pressure, which was nothing, and the nothing looked different now that Seo-jun understood it, the way words looked different once you knew they were in code. "What does Baek actually need from tonight?" Seo-jun asked. "Not what he told you, what you understood from 14 months of proximity to it." Do-hyun looked at the floor, then back up. "He doesn't want to destroy you," he said. "That was true, what you told Min and Ro, but it's not the whole thing." He breathed through his nose. "He wants to become you, not take your position, take your model, the architecture you built, the way the organization interfaces with legitimate structures. He wants to absorb it with himself at the center instead of you." A pause. "You're too embedded to simply remove. He needs you to hand it over, to sign it over, structurally, through the financial framework. The Incheon accounts, the holding companies, the terminus accounts in 3 countries. He needs your signature on the transition, not literally, but legally, in a way that can't be reversed. And to get that, he needs leverage. The ledgers plus the data from Singapore plus one more thing," Do-hyun said. "He needs to be able to demonstrate to Ha-soo-yeon that he has operational control of your security apparatus, that he can guarantee her people safe passage through your network during the transition." His jaw tightened. "I was supposed to be that demonstration." Seo-jun looked at him for a long time. "Your wife and son," he said. "Daejeon." "Yes." "Are they actually under watch, or did Baek tell you they were?" Something crossed Do-hyun's face, fast and ugly and very human. I didn't know how to verify it without... Have you spoken to your wife tonight?" "She thinks I'm working. She always thinks I'm working." "Call her." Do-hyun stared at him. "Call her right now," Seo-jun said. "On your own phone." He handed it back. "Find out if she's safe." Do-hyun's hands were not steady when he took the phone. This was the first time in 11 years that Seo-jun had seen Do-hyun's hands shake. He watched the man dial. Watched him hold the phone to his ear, watched his face do something private and complicated while it rang. She answered. Seo-jun could hear her voice faintly, sleepy, mild, the voice of someone who had gone to bed at a reasonable hour and was mildly puzzled to be woken. Do-hyun spoke to her for 40 seconds. Normal words. The words of a husband checking in. "Are you okay? Just wanted to hear your voice. Go back to sleep. I love you." He ended the call. He stood with the phone in his hand. "She's fine," he said. His voice had developed a crack in it somewhere in the last 40 seconds. "She doesn't know anything. There's no one watching the house. There never was." His hand tightened on the phone. He showed me photographs of the neighborhood, of her walking to the market, my son at school, and I believed..." He stopped. I believed him. The crack in his voice widened into something that wasn't quite a sound. He pressed his fist against his mouth. Seo-jun watched him absorb the specific dimension of what he had spent 14 months carrying. Not a real threat, a manufactured one, a sequence of photographs, an implied menace that had been enough to turn a man who had never broken in a decade of real danger. "He knew you," Seo-jun said quietly. He knew exactly what to use. Do-hyun lowered his fist. His eyes were red. He did not look away. "I know that doesn't..." "Stop." Seo-jun held up one hand. Not harshly. Just the word, flat and final, cutting off whatever accounting Do-hyun was about to attempt. "We don't have time for it. I need to know one thing, right now. Where is Baek?" Do-hyun wiped his face with the back of his hand, one quick movement, and the crack was gone. Or it was driven somewhere below the surface where it would stay until there was room for it. He left the Hanam party at 1:45. His driver took him to his office building in Seocho. Alone? 4 men, his private team. Not the 6 outside, those are contractors. His personal 4 travel with him always. Seo-jun was already moving down the corridor toward the fire door. The feeds, he said, not turning around. Baek has eyes on this building. How? Do-hyun's footsteps behind him. A receiver unit on the 14th floor, office space leased to a shell 8 months ago. And if that unit were disabled? He goes blind on this building. Seo-jun pushed through the fire door. The stairwell was concrete and cold, and the lighting was the harsh emergency white of infrastructure that expected nothing pleasant from the people who used it. His footsteps hit the stairs hard and even. 14th floor, he said. East side. The receiver is in a junction box behind the 3rd server rack. It's not large. You installed it? A half-beat pause as they moved down the stairs. Yes. Then you can remove it. They hit the 14th floor landing. Do-hyun went ahead through the door and Seo-jun followed, and the office space they entered was dark and smelled of a working server environment, cool and slightly charged, the hum of machines doing invisible things. Do-hyun moved through it without hesitation because he knew exactly where he had put what he was now going to take out. Seo-jun watched the windows while Do-hyun worked. The Seocho skyline, south across the river. Somewhere in that direction, in an office building, Baek Jun-ho was sitting with 4 men who were loyal to him in the honest way that loyalty worked when it was purchased rather than manufactured. And he was receiving information, or he had been, before Chanmin left the building, before Kwon headed to Mappo, before Do-hyun put his hands into a junction box on the 14th floor. He was receiving the information that the architecture had been exposed, that Seo-jun knew. And a man like Baek Jun-ho, in a position like the one he currently occupied, when faced with the information that his design sequence had been disrupted, such a man did not sit still. He moved to the contingency. Every design sequence had a contingency, and the contingency was the thing Baek had prepared for the scenario where Seo-jun didn't walk into the corridor in Mappo. The contingency was the one piece of leverage that existed independent of Seo-jun's cooperation. Seo-jun had been turning it over since the corridor, since Ji-yeon's call, and it had been sitting just outside his full articulation, and now it arrived with the clarity of something that should have been obvious, and was only obvious in retrospect. The contingency was not financial. Baek had the financial architecture, or enough of it. The contingency was not organizational. Do-hyun had been his organizational lever, and that lever was gone. The contingency was personal, and personal meant the one thing that had changed in the last 14 months, the one variable Baek's 14 months of surveillance had identified and cataloged and set aside for exactly this use. The restaurant on the 22nd floor. The woman in burgundy with the steady eyes. The little girl in the pink dress who had waved at him from across the room. Seo-jun's phone was already in his hand before the thought had finished forming. He called the private number. Not Naomi's number, because he didn't have Naomi's number, and the realization of this was a specific and terrible kind of cold. He called the restaurant's main line because it was all he had, because the address of Chong-su was inside his phone through the building's registered number, because she was still up there. They had to still be up there. It was barely past 2 a.m., and the dinner service on New Year's ran late. It rang. A host answered with the cheerful exhaustion of someone 3 hours into a holiday shift. Seo-jun identified himself by the ownership code that very few people knew, which immediately changed the host's register from cheerful exhaustion to focused attention. The table in the corner, he said, near the window. The woman and the child. Are they still there? A pause. He could hear the host looking, could hear the ambient sound of the restaurant still running, the clatter and murmur of a late New Year's service. Sir, the host said, and something in her voice had changed again, tighter and less certain, the voice of someone delivering information they weren't sure how to frame. The table was vacated about 20 minutes ago. They left on their own? Sir, there were 2 men. They came in about 30 minutes ago. They spoke to the woman briefly at the table, and then she and the child left with them. She seemed... I wasn't sure if it was... The host stopped. She did not seem distressed, but the child looked... Give me a description of the men, Seo-jun said. She gave him a description. He ended the call. Do-hyun was behind him now, the receiver unit in his hand, the building's security feed going dark in Baek's Seocho office at this exact moment. Seo-jun turned to face him. His voice, when it came, was very quiet and entirely without the flatness of before. What was in it now was something different, something that had not been in his voice in a very long time, something that lived below strategy and below calculation and below the 20 years of constructed impregnability, something that was simply fear, not the managed operational awareness of danger that he had carried for 20 years, like a tool he knew how to use, not the cold calculation of risk and response. This was the other kind, the kind that lived in the stomach, that moved through the hands, that had no use and no direction, and simply arrived and sat there, enormous and unhelpful, the fear of a man who has discovered that something he did not know he valued has been placed in danger by his own existence. He breathed through it. 2 seconds. 3. Then he moved. Beck's Seocho office, he said to Do-hyun. How many floors up? 31st. Parking structure access? Basement 2 has a private bay. Coded entry. The code rotates weekly. Do-hyun's jaw was tight. I have the current code. He gave it to me in case I needed to reach him directly. Sojun was already through the stairwell door and moving down. Call it into me as we go. And Do-hyun? He didn't slow down. If there's anything else, anything you know that I don't know yet, now is the only time it helps either of us. Do-hyun's footsteps were right behind him on the stairs. There's a secondary holding on the woman, he said. Not just the restaurant pickup. Beck has her address. The apartment in Mapogu. He's had it for 2 weeks, since the Singapore data came through and Min's name appeared in the system cross-check. Sojun stopped on the landing between floors 9 and 8. Min's name. Min accessed the Singapore firm's network to pull Ferraro's activity log. She tripped a sensor. The sensor flagged her access to Beck's team. Beck ran a trace on who in your organization had the capability to make that access. Do-hyun stopped 2 steps above him. The trace came back with Min's profile, and her profile had a flag, a personal connection she'd disclosed when she joined, a nonprofit educational organization she'd donated to. It operates out of the same international development network as Naomi Johnson's organization, Seojun said. Yes. The stairwell hummed with the building's mechanical systems. Somewhere below them, the basement garage waited. Somewhere across the river, Baek Junho sat in his office knowing that Seojun knew, and knowing that Seojun now knew what Baek held. He identified her from Min's profile, Seojun said. 2 weeks ago, before tonight, Do-hyun confirmed. He's been watching her for 2 weeks. I found out 4 days ago from one of the transmissions I was asked to verify. I should have told you. Yes, Seojun said. You should have. He went down the stairs. The basement was cold and smelled of oil and the specific silence of underground structures at 2 in the morning. One car waited near the far wall, not one of the organizational fleet, a plain dark sedan that Do-hyun had access to through a secondary arrangement, the kind of vehicle that didn't show up in logs. They got in. Do-hyun drove. Seojun was on the phone before the engine turned over. He called Min. She answered in one ring, which meant she hadn't slept, which meant she was still at her screens doing exactly what he'd asked, and had probably been doing it with the specific focused intensity she brought to tasks that she understood were urgent without being told why. The nonprofit, he said. Naomi Johnson's organization. Do you have a contact number for her personally? A pause of approximately 4 seconds, which was Min locating something she'd already found, and was deciding how to present it. I have her Korean cell number from the organization's staff directory. I pulled it 40 minutes ago when I was cross-referencing the Singapore trace. You knew, he said. I suspected, she said. I didn't want to bring it to you until I was certain. Send me the number. Already sent. A beat. Boss, I'm sorry. The Singapore access was my mistake. It was a mistake, he said. We're not discussing it right now. He ended the call. The number was in his phone. He stared at it for 2 seconds, which was the time it took to understand that calling it was either the right move or the move that confirmed to Beck's people that Seojun knew where she was and intended to reach her, which, if Beck's people were monitoring her phone, announced his hand before he played it. He put the phone in his pocket without calling. How long to Seocho, he said. 12 minutes at this hour. Make it 8. Do-hyun made it 8. The city moved past the windows in its post-midnight configuration, quieter than 2 hours ago. The density of celebration thinned out, the street surfaces wet from a brief sleet that Seojun hadn't noticed beginning or ending, the remaining pedestrians moving with the particular purposefulness of people who had somewhere to be rather than the drifting warmth of people celebrating. Traffic lights cycled through their sequence for nearly empty intersections. The Han River appeared and disappeared between buildings as they crossed south. Seojin used the 8 minutes. He called a man named Choi Byung-wook, who was 55, and who ran a private security and asset recovery firm that operated in the spaces where legal authority ended and where people with sufficient resources could engage alternative solutions. Seo-jun had used him twice in 12 years, which was exactly the frequency appropriate for a resource you wanted to remain available. Choi answered on the second ring with the unruffled readiness of someone who had built a career around being reachable at any hour. "I have a location situation," Seo-jun said. "A woman and a child, Korean-American, being held or transported by a two-man private team, last seen leaving a restaurant in Yowido 25 minutes ago. I need their current location. Time frame: 20 minutes. Resources required. Whatever it takes, bill accordingly. I'll need the original departure point and the vehicle description." Seojun gave him what the restaurant host had given him. Two men, both in dark coats, one with close-cropped hair, a dark SUV waiting at the building's entrance. No plates visible from the host's angle. He gave him the timestamp. He gave him the building's address and the direction they had most likely taken from it based on the route to Seocho. "Give me 15 minutes, Choi said. I said 20. I'll have something in 15. The car pulled into the Seocho district. The building Beck used for his private office was a tower of glass and structural steel, 40 stories, the kind of architecture that communicated ambition without apology. The lobby, visible through the ground floor glass, was empty except for a security desk. The parking structure entrance was on the south side, a ramp descending below street level behind a gate operated by a keypad. Do-yeon gave him the code without being asked. Seojun got out of the car before it fully stopped. He was moving toward the keypad when Do-yeon said, "Boss?" He turned. Do-yeon was out of the car, standing beside the open driver's door. In his hand was his service weapon, a compact 9mm that had lived in a shoulder holster under his left arm for 11 years, and that Seo-jun had watched him draw and reholster 10,000 times, in the way you watched anything that repeated enough to become invisible. He was holding it grip out across the car's roof. Seo-jun looked at it. "I can't go in there with you," Do-hyun said. "If Beck sees me—" "I know. But you shouldn't go in without—" Seo-jun took the weapon, checked it with the automatic competence of someone who had not forgotten the knowledge even after years of employing people, so he didn't have to use it directly. Full magazine. Round-chambered. He put it in his coat pocket. "Stay with the car," he said. "If I'm not out in 30 minutes, call Choi Byung-wook and tell him to accelerate whatever he's doing. And if Baek has people in the basement, then the next 30 minutes will be shorter than expected." He punched the code. The gate rose. He walked down the ramp into the basement's white fluorescent cold. The private bay was where Do-yeon had said, "Far left corner," a sectioned-off area behind a half-wall of concrete with its own secondary gate, the kind of arrangement that allowed a building's most significant occupant to arrive and depart without intersecting with anyone else using the structure. Beck's vehicle was there, a black executive SUV, the kind with reinforced panels and tinted glass that was standard for people who believed they needed it. A driver sat in the front seat reading something on his phone, the phone's light making his face a pale blue island in the dark of the vehicle's interior. One man, watching the vehicle, not expecting approach from inside the structure. Seo-jun moved along the far wall, using the parked vehicles for coverage. There were 6 of them, civilians' cars from the building's residential units above, none of them occupied. His shoes were quiet on the concrete. The driver in Baek's SUV had not looked up from his phone. 30 feet, 20. 10. He came around the front of the vehicle fast. The driver looked up at exactly the wrong moment, which was the moment when there was no time to do anything useful, and Seo-jun had the door open and the man's phone out of his hand, and the weapon visible in a sequence that lasted roughly 2 seconds, and resulted in the driver sitting very still with his hands open on his thighs, and his face performing the specific rapid recalibration of someone processing new information at speed. "How many men upstairs?" Seo-jun said. The driver was perhaps 35, built for the job, the kind of face that had absorbed impact before and wore it without drama. He looked at the weapon in Seo-jun's hand. He looked at Seo-jun's face. He made a calculation. 4, he said. Baek. With them. Anyone else? The driver's eyes moved, the involuntary direction of the gaze toward the piece of information being withheld, a tell so common it had stopped surprising Seo-jun years ago. There are people on the 31st floor, not his team. Arrivals. 20 minutes ago. How many? 2. A woman and a child. The fear behind Seo-jun's sternum clenched once, hard, like a fist closing. He breathed through it. They're unharmed. The driver said nothing, which was not confirmation of harm. It was the silence of someone who either didn't know or wasn't going to say. Seo-jun took the driver's phone, took the man's own weapon from the holster under his jacket, put him in the back seat with the instruction to stay there, and the understanding, delivered through the flat certainty of Seo-jun's eyes rather than through anything elaborate, that this instruction was not optional. He closed the door. He took the private elevator from the basement bay to the 31st floor. It was a slow elevator, the kind built for executive comfort rather than speed, with wood paneling and brushed brass fixtures and a number display that counted up through the floors with excruciating deliberateness. Seo-jun stood in it and breathed. His heartbeat was elevated, not racing, elevated, the distinction being the difference between adrenaline with direction and adrenaline without it. He had direction. He had had direction since the moment the restaurant host's voice changed on the phone. Floor 25, 27, 29. He positioned himself to the right of the elevator doors. The doors opened on the 31st floor. Nothing happened. He waited 3 seconds. Then he moved through them low and fast and came up against the wall to the left. And the space he entered was a reception area, dark except for the ambient light bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows that covered the room's entire south face. Seoul spread below in its 3 a.m. configuration, quieter than before and more honest for it. The city stripped of its celebratory noise and returned to its working self. No one in the reception area. The space beyond was open plan. A large executive suite that took up half the floor, divided by glass partitions into sections. Light came from the far end, warm and directed, an office setup behind a final glass wall. Shadows moved in it. Seo-jun moved through the dark of the open space toward the light. He was 15 feet from the glass partition when a figure stepped out of the shadow to his left and hit him from the side. Fast, trained, aimed at his weapon hand. He got the gun clear of the body before impact, but the collision took him into a desk's edge, and something in his left side registered hard contact, and he spun with the momentum rather than against it, and came around to face the man, one of Baek's 4. Bigger than Seo-jun, which meant something but not as much as it had once meant when he was younger and relied more heavily on size differentials. The man came back in with the directness of someone who had been trained well and had probably not fought someone who had spent 15 years making sure the people trying to fight him weren't alive to try again. Seo-jun gave him the first half of the second approach, and then wasn't there for the second half, and what followed was brief and extremely physical, and resulted in the desk behind the man becoming briefly load-bearing for the man's full weight before he stopped being a factor. Seo-jun straightened. His left side hurt. He breathed through it and assessed. Not a rib, probably. Something muscular, manageable. His coat had taken the desk edge on the forearm. The weapon was still in his hand. Movement in the glass office ahead. The shadows had reconfigured. Someone had moved, quickly, towards something or away from something. He heard a voice. Low, calm, unsurprised. "Come in, Seo-jun-si." Baek Junho's voice. He went through the glass partition door. The office was large and spare, the kind of space that communicated that its occupant needed nothing extraneous to think clearly. A single wide desk, clean surface, 2 chairs facing it, windows on 2 sides. And there, at the far end of the room, not at the desk, but standing near the left side window, with the particular ease of a man who had arranged the furniture of a situation to his own satisfaction, was Baek Junho. He was compact and clean-featured, the kind of man who looked younger than 46 through some combination of genetics and the specific physical care of someone who understood that appearance was a working tool. He was in a dark jacket, no tie, the jacket slightly too good to be business casual and slightly too casual to be formal. The exact register of someone who wanted you to know they could afford better and had chosen not to bother. He was not holding a weapon. He didn't need to. Because standing to the right of the desk, near the second window, was a man Seo-jun had not yet encountered tonight. Taller than Baek's team downstairs, different bearing, the specific stillness of someone trained in contexts more extreme than corporate security. And this man had his hand on the shoulder of a small girl in a pink dress with a grass stain on the hem. And beside the girl, her arm around the girl's shoulders with a rigidity that was pure controlled fear pressed into the shape of calm, was Naomi Johnson. She looked at him. Their eyes met across the room, and in the half second of that contact, he read everything she was doing. Holding herself together, holding Amara together, keeping her face from showing the girl anything the girl didn't need to see. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were steady. She was afraid, and she was managing it with a ferocity that registered in Seo-jun's chest as something he could not afford right now, and felt anyway. Amara was looking at him too. Her face was different from the restaurant, not the open, cheerful attention of a child waving across a crowded room. Her face was small and careful. The face of a child who had been exposed to something she didn't fully understand and had decided that the best thing she could do was be very still and pay very close attention. Her hands were in her lap. She was not crying. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything all evening, like the answer was in there somewhere and she just needed to find it. "Sit down," Beck said, gesturing to the chair facing the desk. Hospitality without warmth. The phrasing of a man who considered the architecture of the room already settled. Seo-jun didn't sit. "Let them go. We'll discuss Saw." "Let them go first. Then we discuss." Beck regarded him with the patient interest of a man examining a phenomenon he'd predicted. "You walked in here alone," he said. "I have to say, I expected something more orchestrated. More you." A slight tilt of the head. "Unless this is the orchestration and I'm misreading it." "I walked in here alone," Seo-jun said, "because I didn't need anyone else." "Your confidence is—" "They have nothing to do with any of this," Seo-jun said. His voice was level. He was working very hard to keep it level. "The woman runs an educational nonprofit. The child is 8 years old. Whatever you think putting them in this room accomplishes, it accomplishes nothing. I'm here. Talk to me." "You're here," Beck agreed, 3 hours earlier than I expected, which is either impressive or reckless, and I haven't decided which." He moved to the desk and sat behind it with the unhurried ease of someone who believed the ground beneath him was entirely stable. "I want to discuss a structural transition, a reorganization of several financial and operational arrangements. You know the ones I mean." "I know them. I want your cooperation. Voluntary, documented, uncontested." He folded his hands on the desk. "In exchange, this situation," a gesture toward Naomi and Amara, "that managed to be both minimal and unmistakable, ends immediately and cleanly. The woman and child return to their evening. No further contact. My word." "Your word," Seo-jun said. "I understand that currency has limitations from a man you've recently discovered has been operating inside your organization for 14 months. Beck's expression was unruffled. "But consider, I haven't harmed them. I could have. I didn't. The operational value of this situation to me is entirely contingent on them being unharmed. Harm produces problems I don't need. I brought them here as a conversation starter, nothing more." "Then start the conversation after you've sent them out. I need them present until we have an agreement." "We can't have an agreement with them present." Beck tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because," Seo-jun said, "everything I agree to in front of that child, I'll spend whatever time I have left making sure never actually happens. And you know that. Because you've spent 14 months reading my organization, and you understand how I operate, and you know that whatever I agree to under this kind of pressure is an agreement I will burn down at the earliest opportunity, even if burning it costs me more than compliance would have." He held Beck's gaze. "Send them out. I'll give you what you need. Not because of them, in spite of them. Because you've built something that has corners I can't currently get out of, and I'm not a man who fights losing positions past the point of reason. Send them out, and we'll settle this." The room was quiet. Beck looked at Seo-jun with the expression of a man running a rapid and sophisticated assessment. He was intelligent, genuinely, structurally intelligent, the kind of intelligence that had built something real over 20 years and had then decided that real things could be taken as well as built. He was reading Seo-jun the way Seo-jun read rooms, and what he was trying to determine was whether what he was hearing was genuine capitulation or the first move of something else. Seo-jun let him read. He kept his face open in the specific way of a man who had given up, not defeated, not crushed, just past the point of productive resistance. It was, he had discovered over 20 years, the most difficult expression to produce convincingly and the most valuable. Most people couldn't hold it because capitulation required the temporary surrender of pride, and pride was the last thing most powerful men would actually let go. Seojun had let go of things more important than pride in service of longer games. He watched Baek make his decision. Baek looked at the man beside Naomi and Amara. A small gesture, a tilt of the chin toward the door. The man released Amara's shoulder and stepped back. Naomi moved immediately. Not running, she didn't run. She kept herself controlled and moved Amara toward the door, with the specific deliberateness of a woman who understood that panic was the enemy of exit. Amara moved with her. At the door, Amara stopped. She looked back at Seojun. He looked at her. "Go," he said. Quietly. Just the word. She held his gaze for one more second, this child who had waved at a stranger from across a crowded restaurant because he looked lost, who had put her small, warm hand in his because handshakes mattered, who had given him a silver star balloon and told him it was so he'd remember. And she looked at him now with those same eyes that missed nothing and forgave everything, and then she let her mother move her through the door. The door closed. The room was 3 people. Seojun, Baek, and the man who had been beside Amara, now repositioned to the left of the desk. Somewhere outside this office, 2 more of Baek's 4 were active. One was the man on the floor between the desks in the outer room, who was no longer a factor, and that left 2 others unaccounted for. "Appreciate the gesture," Baek said. He opened a drawer and removed a folder. Actual paper, which was Baek performing the same theater Chong had performed. The power move of a man who kept physical records in a digital world. "Now, let's discuss the Incheon structure. I'll walk you through what I have and what I need, and we'll identify the..." Seojun's phone vibrated. He pulled it out, made no attempt to hide it, looked at the screen. Choi Byung-wook. With the woman and the child's current location confirmed, except the location was this building, which meant Choi's people were outside, which meant the external situation had changed while Seojun was inside. And on the same screen, below Choi's message, a second notification. From Kwan, who had gone to Mappo to retrieve his sister. 3 words. "She's with me." Seojun looked up from the phone. Baek had watched him look at the phone. His eyes were slightly narrower. "Something you need to respond to?" "No," Seojun said. He put the phone away. He looked at Baek Junho across the clean surface of the desk, in the office that overlooked Seoul at 3 in the morning, with everything Baek had built over 14 months and everything Seojun had built over 20 years sitting between them in the charged and fragile air. And then Seojun smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not the unfamiliar, almost surprised expression that had moved across his face in the restaurant when Amara called him direct. It was something older and more specific. The smile of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has just heard the particular sound of a moment arriving. Baek's hands flattened on the folder. "The building's security feed went dark 18 minutes ago," Seojun said. "You know this because your team told you. You assumed it was a technical fault because the alternative that someone disabled it deliberately from inside, suggested a level of operational access that was supposed to be impossible." He tilted his head. "It wasn't Do-hyun who disabled it. Do-hyun was with me. It was Do-hyun who told me where the receiver was. And then Do-hyun who handed me his weapon in a parking structure in Junggu, which is an act that, whatever else it means, is not the act of a man who has chosen the side you paid him to be on." Baek said nothing. His face had gone to careful. "The woman and the child are outside the building," Seojun continued. "My people reached them in the lobby when your man brought them through. He didn't know my people because my people are not Do-hyun's selections. They're Min's, recruited through a network that Do-hyun was never read into because I compartmentalize in ways that 14 months of proximity doesn't fully penetrate." He let that sit for 1 second. "They're safe. They've been safe for approximately 4 minutes." The man to Baek's left shifted. Seojun looked at him. "I wouldn't," he said. The man looked at Baek. Baek's composure was still present, but it had changed texture. It was no longer the composure of a man who knew the shape of the room. It was the composure of someone holding a position by force of will while the ground moved beneath it. His hands were still flat on the folder. His face was doing what Do-hyun's face had done in the corridor, which was nothing, but the nothing was working harder than it should have needed to. "You came in here alone," Baek said. His voice was even. "That was true. I came in here alone," Seojun agreed, "because I needed 14 minutes inside this building, and I needed your attention on me for those 14 minutes. And I needed you to believe the situation was still what you designed it to be." He stood from the chair, and in the standing was the conclusion of the performance he'd been giving since he walked through the door. The Incheon accounts, the ledgers, the Singapore data package, you built something real. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. In a different sequence, it might have been enough. But you used Doyon, and Doyon had a pressure point that was manufactured, and manufactured pressure points are fragile in ways that real ones aren't. He had 14 months of guilt and no real reason to be afraid, and when those two things came together tonight, he made a different choice. Beck looked at him. In the long quiet that followed, something moved through Beck's face that wasn't quite any single thing. Not fear, not anger, not the hot shame of being outplayed. Something more complicated and more honest. The expression of a man who has understood, all at once, the distance between what he thought he'd built and what he actually had. "The Ha group," Sojun said. "Ha Suyeon. She's waiting on your signal." Still nothing from Baek. "Call her," Sojun said. "Tell her the signal isn't coming." Beck's jaw tightened, 1 degree. "And if I don't?" Sojun looked at him across the desk, across everything. The 14 months, the dead man in Mappo, the silver star balloon pressed against a restaurant ceiling, the 8-year-old who had looked back at him from a doorway with eyes that missed nothing. "Then we find out," he said quietly, "which one of us has more left to lose." The man to Beck's left moved his hand toward his jacket, and the window behind Beck went white, not glass breaking, not yet. The searchlight from the rooftop of the building across the street, the one that Choi Byung-wook's team had requisitioned from the filming equipment company that owed Seo-jun a significant favor, hit the 31st floor windows and turned the entire room into a blaze of white light that lasted exactly 4 seconds and was followed by the sound of 4 vehicles stopping simultaneously on the street below. And the particular quality of organized movement that only happened when multiple trained people arrived somewhere at the same time with a shared and specific purpose. Beck's man froze. Beck himself sat perfectly still in the white light, hands flat on the folder, face receiving the information of what was outside the window with the stillness of someone who had prepared for many contingencies and had not prepared for this one. "The building is surrounded," Seo-jun said, and his voice was very quiet now, the way it went when there was nothing left to prove, and the only thing remaining was the fact. "Not by my people, by Choi Byung-wook's people, who operate under a licensing arrangement that gives them a specific category of authority in situations involving the unlawful detention of civilians, which is what tonight has been." He let that land. "Director Yoon knows you have her former employee's name on a corporate filing. I sent that information to her while I was in the elevator coming up. She's not in this play with you. She was buying time to figure out what you had on her, and now she knows, and that relationship is over. And the 36 hours she offered me, she's now spending making sure her name isn't anywhere near yours when morning comes." He looked at Baek's hand on the folder. The paper in that folder. The Incheon structure. "I want you to look at it very carefully because in about 6 minutes, the men outside are going to come into this building, and everything in this room becomes evidence, and the question of what that evidence shows about who is trying to do what, to whom, tonight is going to be the question that determines the next several years of both our lives." Beck looked at the folder. He looked at it for a long time. His hand moved off it. "What do you want?" he said. Not the calculated voice of earlier, something quieter. The voice under the voice. Seo-jun looked at him. Outside the windows of the 31st floor, Seoul continued its 3 a.m. operations in total indifference to the room and everything in it. The lights, the bridges, the river moving dark and cold between the parts of the city that didn't know or care what happened in the high floors of its towers. "I want," Seo-jun said, and then stopped. He thought of Amara in the lobby, 4 floors below, her mother's arm around her, finally outside the room where none of this was supposed to touch them. He thought of the silver star balloon he had left with a confused doorman at the entrance of a different building hours ago, and how it was probably still there, floating in some corner of a lobby, pressing its small silver self against the ceiling in the patient way of things that hadn't been told they were supposed to come down. He breathed. "I want," he said again, "a very different conversation than the one you planned." And then the door behind him opened, and the next part of the night began in a way that neither man in the room had fully written for himself. And the city outside kept doing what cities did, keeping going, indifferent and brilliant and cold, lit up against the dark in the way of things that... The men who came through the door were Choi Byung-wook's, 3 of them, and they moved through the space with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this in worse rooms under worse conditions and considered the current situation relatively straightforward. They secured Beck's remaining man without drama. They placed themselves between Beck and the exits without being asked. Choi himself came in last, a compact man in his mid-50s with the unremarkable face of someone who had spent decades being unremembered on purpose, wearing a dark coat and carrying a tablet with documentation that he handed to Beck's man without comment, which was the documentation establishing the legal basis for the evening's intervention. Beck sat behind his desk and watched all of this with the stillness of a man who had decided that the most dignified available option was perfect composure, and who was executing that option with everything he had. Seo-jun watched him. He thought about what it cost a person to build what Bayek had built, the patience of it, the architecture, the 14 months of sustained deception, the genuine intelligence required to identify vulnerabilities in a structure that Seo-jun had spent 20 years making as close to impenetrable as a human organization could be. He thought about this not with admiration and not with contempt, but with the sober recognition of a man looking at a mirror angled slightly wrong. Same materials, different outcome, and the difference smaller than comfortable. "The folder," Seo-jun said. Beck looked at it. Then he pushed it across the desk. Seo-jun picked it up. He didn't open it. He handed it to Choi, who handed it to one of his men, who placed it in a document bag with the practiced neutrality of someone who had long since stopped being curious about the contents of things he was paid to transport. "The Singapore data package," Seo-jun said. "The complete file that Ferraro transmitted tonight." "It's in a cloud partition," Beck said. His voice was stripped of its earlier ease, not broken, controlled, but the control was effortful now in a way it hadn't been before. "I can have it deleted." "You can give me the access credentials," Seo-jun said. "My people will handle it." A pause. Beck looked at him with something that wasn't quite evaluation anymore. It was past evaluation. It was the look of a man who had run out of positions to evaluate from. He recited a string of credentials. Min, on the phone in Seo-jun's pocket, recorded them without being asked, because Seo-jun had called her 3 minutes before entering the building and left the line open, which was the oldest and simplest form of documentation, and which worked because it was old and simple, and people with complicated plans sometimes forgot about simple things. "Ha Soo-yeon," Seo-jun said. Baek's jaw moved once. She doesn't know the details. She knows an opportunity was being developed. She doesn't know the mechanism. Then the mechanism disappears, and the opportunity was never real. Seo-jun looked at him steadily. "She'll move on. She's patient." "She is," Beck agreed, with the faint, involuntary quality of a man acknowledging a truth that no longer served him. Seo-jun picked up his coat from the chair. He had set it there when he sat down, which felt like a long time ago and was perhaps 20 minutes ago, time having done what it always did under pressure, which was become unreliable. He put the coat on, buttoned it. The left side still hurt where the desk had caught him. He moved through it. He stopped at the door. "Baek Junho," he said. The man behind the desk looked at him. "The Incheon structure," Seo-jun said. "It was a real play. You identified a real vulnerability and you built a real approach, and if you'd moved 6 months earlier, before the Singapore trace triggered Min, you'd have had a different conversation tonight." He held Baek's gaze. "I want you to know that I know that. Not because it changes anything, because accurate information is the only kind worth having, and I don't like pretending I wasn't touched when I was." Beck looked at him for a long moment. "You're an unusual man," Beck said. "I've been told," Seo-jun said, and left. The elevator down was the same slow wood-paneled box it had been going up, and he stood in it and breathed and did the accounting that his mind ran automatically after any significant event. What was intact? What was damaged? What needed immediate attention? What could wait? The Incheon structure would need restructuring. The security apparatus would need complete rebuilding from Min's layer outward, which was expensive and time-consuming and would leave gaps during the rebuild period. Director Yoon was a neutralized variable for now, but not permanently. She was too intelligent and too entrenched to remain neutralized, and the information he'd sent her about the Park Ji-hye corporate filing was a leash, not a cage. Prosecutor Lim had a 7 a.m. meeting that Seo-jun would now attend with a substantially different set of cards than either of them had expected. And Do-yeon. The elevator reached the ground floor. Do-yeon was in the lobby. He had come in from the street while Choi's people were securing the perimeter, and he was standing near the far wall with the particular quality of a man who had placed himself where he could be seen and was making no attempt to be anywhere else. His hands were at his sides. His face was doing nothing. He watched Seojun cross the lobby toward him and did not move and did not speak. Seojun stopped in front of him. The lobby was active, Choi's people moving through it, two of them with Naomi and Amara near the entrance, a third on a phone. The sounds of the operation filled the space with the quiet purposefulness of people doing their jobs. In the middle of it, the two of them stood in a stillness that was separate from the room's activity. "My wife," Do-yeon said. His voice was a different instrument than it had been in the car. Something had happened to it in the hours since then. The crack that had opened when he called her was still present, no longer controlled, sitting in the surface of every word. "She doesn't know any of this." "No," Seojun said. "My son is 14. "I know." Do-yeon looked at the floor between them, then back up. His eyes were dry and very direct, which was the most painful version of the look. Not the look of someone asking for mercy. The look of someone who has decided they don't deserve to ask and is looking anyway, out of something that wasn't hope but was shaped like it. "Whatever you decide," he said. "I'll tell Chang-soon myself. My wife. I'll tell her." Seojun was quiet for a moment. "You called back from the stairwell at 2:11 a.m., he said. "You told him I knew, which gave him 20 minutes to move before I reached this building. He used those 20 minutes to bring Naomi Johnson and the child upstairs." Do-hyun received this without flinching. "If you hadn't made that call," Sojun said, "they would have been released from the lobby. They would have never gone to the 31st floor. The child would never have been in that room." "Yeah." "Yes," Do-hyun said, low and exact. "The call you made in the elevator," Seojun said. "Before that. You gave Baek 14 months and one final transmission. Against that," he paused. The pause was not for effect. It was genuine. He was finding the words for something he had not yet put into words. "Against that, you handed me your weapon in a parking structure. And you told me the truth about the receiver unit, and about Chanmin, and about what Baek actually wanted. Information that, without it, I walk into this building without the full picture and the evening ends differently." Do-yeon said nothing. "I don't forgive the 14 months, Seojun said. "I want to be clear about that. And I don't forgive the call from the stairwell. Those things happened, and they have weight, and they're not being set aside." He held Do-yeon's eyes. "But you made a different choice in the parking structure. And a man who makes a different choice when it costs him something to do it, that's a data point." Do-yeon's throat moved. "You're done with me," Seojun said. "That's finished, and it doesn't change. You clear out of the organization before morning, and you take nothing that belongs to it, and you contact no one in it after today. Your severance will be what it would have been if you'd left clean, because your family doesn't bear the weight of your choices, and I'm not going to make them do it." He held Do-yeon's gaze for one more second. "But you go home tonight to your wife and your son in Daejeon, and that's because of the parking structure. Not in spite of everything else. Because of the parking structure." Do-hyun looked at him. Something in the man's face went through several things in rapid sequence, none of which Seojun tried to name because they weren't his to name. What settled at the end was not relief, and was not gratitude, and was not the clean release of a verdict. It was something more complicated and more durable than any of those. The expression of a man who has received something he knows he didn't earn and is going to have to live with the gap between those two facts for the rest of his life. "Go home," Seojun said. Do-yeon went. Seojun turned toward the entrance. Naomi was standing 15 feet away. Amara was beside her, half leaning against her mother's arm, with the particular physical weight of a child who has burned through an enormous amount of adrenaline and is now running on something closer to fumes. She was still in the pink dress. She still had the white sash, though the bow had come undone at some point in the evening, and the sash now hung in two loose lengths at her sides. Her eyes found Seojun the moment he turned, with the same directness they'd had across a restaurant floor 8 hours ago, as if the geometry of finding him in a room was something her eyes knew how to do without instructions. Naomi was watching him with a careful, unreadable expression that he was beginning to understand was not unreadable exactly. It was the expression of someone who read everything and chose very deliberately what to return. He crossed the lobby to them. He stopped at a distance that was respectful and that acknowledged the weight of what the last several hours had been. And he stood there in his buttoned coat with the ache in his left side and the full accumulated exhaustion of the night settling into him, and he looked at this woman and this child and could not assemble, from the 20 years of language he had built for the situations his life produced, a single sentence that seemed adequate. "Are you hurt?" he said. It was not what he had intended to say. He wasn't sure what he'd intended. The question came out first because it was the most immediate thing. Naomi looked at him. "No," she said. "Amara." "I'm okay," Amara said. Her voice was smaller than it had been in the restaurant. Not frightened, smaller in the specific way of a child who has been very brave for several hours and is now at the edge of it. "The man who brought us here gave us water and told us to sit down and wait. He didn't—" She pressed her lips together. "He didn't do anything bad." "Okay," Sojun said. "But Mom was scared," Amara said. "She didn't show it, but I could tell." Naomi looked at the top of her daughter's head with an expression that was exhausted and fierce in equal measure. "Amara." "It's true," Amara said, not defensively, just the fact. Naomi looked back at Seojun, and in the tired, unguarded honesty of 3:30 in the morning, with the lobby emptying around them and the city visible through the glass doors in its cold blue pre-dawn state, she said, "Yes, I was scared." She said it simply, the way she said most things, and it cost her something to say it, and she said it anyway, and Seojun stood in the lobby of a building he had entered with a borrowed weapon and exited having done what he'd come to do, and felt the night's full weight settle into him with that admission, everything it meant and everything it implied about what his life was and what it touched when it touched people who had nothing to do with it. "I'm sorry," he said. Naomi held his gaze. She was looking for something specific in his face, and he let her look because he had nothing to hide in this particular moment, which was but not a state he was accustomed to, and which was, he was discovering, considerably less uncomfortable than he would have predicted. "Is it over?" she asked. Not naive. The question of someone who wanted accurate information and was asking the person most likely to have it. "The immediate situation is over," he said. "The larger situation—" He stopped. He thought about Prosecutor Lim at 7 a.m. He thought about the Incheon rebuild. He thought about Ha Soo-yeon in Busan, patient in the way she always was, waiting for the next sequence to develop. "The larger situation is what it is." "Meaning it doesn't end," Naomi said. "Meaning it doesn't end," he confirmed. She received this in silence. The kind of silence that was not agreement and not argument, but the sober acknowledgement of a fact by someone who had been waiting to hear it stated clearly. "We're going home," she said. "Yes." He paused. "I'll have someone—" "We'll get a cab," she said. "We're fine." He looked at her. She looked back with the steady eyes that had been steady all night. Across a dinner table in a room full of endangered people and this lobby in the early hours of New Year's Day. And she was telling him something with those eyes that she wasn't going to put into words because they were standing in a lobby at 3:30 in the morning and Amara was leaning against her arm, and the words would cost more than she had left tonight. He understood it anyway. She was telling him that she was not his to protect, that the protection he provided came packaged with the danger that required it, and she had spent a significant portion of the last several hours inside the specific consequences of that packaging. And she had a daughter who was 8 years old and had spent several of those hours in a room on the 31st floor of a building she had no business being in. She was telling him this without anger, which was somehow harder to stand than anger would have been. "Okay," he said. Amara peeled herself off her mother's arm and looked at Seojun directly. He crouched down so that they were at the same level, which was something he had done in the restaurant without thinking, and did again now with the same absence of deliberation. Up close she looked tired and entirely herself. The same eyes, the same quality of attention that held nothing back, the grass stain still on the hem of the dress. She looked at his face the way she had looked at everything all evening, with that total, undefended focus. "You came," she said. "Yes." "I knew you would." She said it without triumph, just the simple statement of a prediction confirmed. "You looked like someone who came back for things." He held her gaze. "I didn't get there fast enough," he said. "You were in that room because of me. I want you to know that I know that." Amara looked at him steadily. "We're okay," she said. "Yes." "So it worked out." "This time," he said, and felt the weight of those two words land in his chest with their full meaning. Amara looked at him for a moment longer. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress, a small patch pocket that he hadn't noticed before, the kind of detail that a dress designer added for exactly the kind of child who needed somewhere to put things, and she took out a folded piece of paper, small, folded twice. She held it out. He took it. "I wrote it at the table," she said, "in the restaurant, before the men came." She paused. "I was going to give it to you before you left. You left too fast." He looked at the folded paper in his hand. "You can open it later," she said, with the specific generosity of a child who understood that some things were private. He closed his fingers around it. Naomi took Amara's hand. She looked at Seojun one final time, and in that look was everything she'd decided across the course of the evening. The dinner, the room upstairs, this lobby, everything she'd assembled about who he was and what that meant, and what the distance was between them and what that distance was made of. It was not a look of rejection. It was not a look of closing a door. It was the look of someone who had seen clearly and was making a clear choice, and he respected it with the full weight of what respect meant when there was nothing to gain from it. "Happy New Year, Seojun-si," she said. "Happy New Year," he said. She walked Amara through the lobby doors and into the cold Seoul morning. He watched them go until the glass doors closed between them and the street, and then until they became shapes moving through the glass, and then until they were around the corner and gone. He stood in the emptied lobby and breathed. Choi appeared at his shoulder with the unobtrusiveness of a man who had been managing the graceful disappearance of himself from situations for 30 years. "The documentation is complete," he said. "Our people are withdrawing. The items from the 31st floor are secured." "Thank you," Seojun said. "You should have that side looked at." Choi's eyes tracked to Seojun's left flank with the evaluating precision of someone who had learned to read injury from posture. "Desk edge?" "Desk edge. Probably a bruised rib, painful, but manageable." "A beat. I'll send you the invoice through the usual channel." "Send it to Min," Seojun said. "She'll be rebuilding the accounting structure. She should know what she's working with." Choi nodded once and was gone. The lobby was empty now except for the building's own night security, who had spent the last 40 minutes at a professional remove from everything that had happened in their building and were now visibly relieved to be returning to a normal configuration. One of them, young, perhaps 22, the kind of age where a night like this registered visibly on the face, was looking at Seojun with the expression that young men in his vicinity sometimes had, which was the expression of someone trying to decide what category of human being they were looking at. Seojun looked back at him without expression, put his hands in his pockets, and walked out into the Seoul morning. The cold hit him cleanly. It was the same cold as earlier, but it felt different against a face that had been inside for several hours. Sharper, more present. The cold of a city that had finished its New Year's celebration and was now in the gray and honest early hours of whatever came next. The street was wet and quiet. Do-hyun's car was still in the secondary lot. Seojun walked to it, got in, moved to the driver's seat, and sat for a moment with the engine off. He opened the folded paper. Amar's handwriting was the careful, deliberate print of a child who had been taught to write with attention and who applied that attention even to small things. The letters were even. The words were short. She had written them, apparently, with a pen borrowed from the restaurant. The ink was the specific midnight blue of Chongsu's branded table pens. It said, "Mr. Seojun." The star was for remembering. "This is in case you forget. You were not lost. You just didn't know where home was yet. Amara J." He read it twice. He folded it back along its creases, very carefully, and put it in his inside breast pocket. He started the car. The drive to his apartment in Yongsan took 18 minutes at this hour, and he made it without music and without calls and without the organizational chatter that normally occupied the spaces of his transit through the city. He drove it in the specific quiet of a man who has used up all his words for the night and has reached the part of a long and significant event where the event has ended and the reckoning has not yet begun, and there is a narrow window of purely physical silence between the two. The apartment building was, like most things connected to him, secure and unremarkable from the outside. He parked in the private bay. He took the elevator up. He let himself into the apartment, which was large and sparsely furnished in the way of spaces that are inhabited by people who sleep there and think there and do not otherwise live there. No accumulated warmth, no layered presence of years of domestic life. Just the clean and somewhat austere atmosphere of a space that had been set up efficiently and had not evolved beyond that setup because there had been no reason for it to evolve. He sat on the edge of the bed without taking his coat off. The window faced east. The sky out there was the color that wasn't quite black and wasn't quite anything else, the color of the hour before the first suggestion of dawn that wasn't dawn yet, but was the end of dark. Seoul hummed below it at its lowest register. The bass note of a city that never fully stopped, the machinery that kept running under and through everything that happened on its surface. He sat with his hands on his knees and his ribs hurting and the folded paper in his breast pocket and let the night arrive at its actual size. It was very large. He thought about Chong Mansu, who had worked for him for 19 years and was in a morgue in Mapo, and would, in the morning, become a problem to be managed, a case to be navigated, a name that could not be attached to other names without careful handling. He would think about Chong the person, the 63-year-old man with the paper ledgers and the private shorthand and the particular old-fashioned pride of someone who believed that what he knew was what made him valuable. He would think about that later, in private, where the accounting of that kind happened. He thought about Do Hyun driving back to Daejeon at 4 in the morning to a house where a woman and a 14-year-old boy were asleep with no knowledge of what the last 14 months had been, and what it would cost a man to walk back into that house and look at those sleeping faces and know what he knew. He thought about the fact that Do Hyun would carry it and probably never tell, because that was the specific loneliness of the choices that couldn't be shared, and he thought about how well he understood that and how little the understanding helped. He thought about his sister Ji-yeon, who was somewhere in Mapo in an apartment with Kwan standing watch outside and who had called him for the first time in 9 years because the alternative was worse, and who had been used, as Chong had been used, because the people closest to him were the available material for anyone who wanted to reach him. He would call her when the sun was up. He didn't know what he would say. He had 9 years of not saying anything, which was its own kind of saying something. And the 9 years would be in the room when he called and they would have to be addressed or they would stand between everything else. He thought about Prosecutor Lim at 7 a.m. and what that conversation needed to accomplish, and how much he had to offer, and how much he needed to withhold, and the specific balance of that exchange, which was complicated, but which he understood. He was good at those conversations. He had been good at them for 20 years. He thought about Naomi Johnson getting a cab in the cold at 3:30 in the morning with her daughter's hand in hers, moving through the city toward the apartment in Mapogu where they lived their actual lives, which had nothing in them that required navigating any of the things Seojun navigated, which were simply the lives of a woman who trained teachers and a child who built bridges out of noodles and spoke Korean with a tone better than her mother's and wrote notes on restaurant paper and put them in her pocket in case she needed to give them to someone. He put his hand over his breast pocket. The paper was there. Outside the window, something changed in the quality of the sky. Too small a change to name with confidence, but present. The first signal of the first hour of the New Year's actual beginning, the dark losing its depth by a fraction. Not light. The precondition of light. The moment before the moment. He stood up. He took off his coat and hung it on the back of the door. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the city through the window for a moment. Just that. Just looking. The way you looked at something you had decided to pay attention to instead of moving through. Then he went to the desk in the corner of the room where he worked when he worked at home, which was always, and he sat down and opened his laptop and pulled up a contact file that he had not opened in 9 years. His sister's number, now updated from the call she had placed tonight, sat at the top. Below it, after a moment's search through a secondary database he accessed rarely, another entry, the NGO staff directory for the International Educational Partnership Organization operating out of Seoul, which had a general contact listed, and below it, a department coordinator's email, and below that nothing personal, nothing direct, nothing that was hers specifically. He sat with the cursor blinking in a new email window for a long time. He did not know what he was going to write. He knew only that the note in his breast pocket said, "You just didn't know where home was yet," and that it had been written by an 8-year-old who had never been wrong about anything she'd said to him, and who had, from a corner table in a restaurant on the 22nd floor, identified something true about him that he had been working very hard not to identify about himself. He started typing. The email was not long. He was not a man who wrote long things when short ones would do, and what he was writing needed to be short because anything longer would give him room to be strategic about it. And strategy was not what this required. It required the thing underneath strategy, which was harder and which he had not used in a long time. He wrote, "I owe you an explanation that I can't give you. I owe her an apology for the same reason. I understand completely if tonight is where this ends. I wanted you to know that I know what tonight cost, and that I know it was because of me, and that I am not going to pretend otherwise." He paused. He wrote, "She wrote me a note. She said I wasn't lost. I don't know if she's right. I'm going to find out." He paused again. He wrote, "I'm sorry." For what it's worth from the person responsible, I'm sorry. He read it back once. He sent it. He closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of the room and the gray of the beginning morning and let the scentness of it exist without trying to manage what it meant or what would come of it. At 6:53 a.m., he dressed and left for the meeting with Prosecutor Lim. The coffee shop on Bukchon sat on a narrow lane that was old enough to predate the surrounding city's appetite for reinvention. Hanok rooflines visible above a low stone wall, the lane itself cobbled and too narrow for any but the smallest vehicles. The kind of soul that survived in pockets between the glass towers and the elevated roads. The coffee shop was 3 tables and a counter and smelled of the first serious coffee of a new year. Prosecutor Lim was already there. He was 53, gaunt in the way of men who forgot to eat when they were under pressure, wearing a gray suit that was expensive 3 years ago and had not been replaced because he didn't have the particular vanity that noticed such things. His hands were around a ceramic mug, and he was staring at the table surface with the focused inward expression of someone who had been thinking very hard through a sleepless night and had arrived at a position he wasn't certain about. He looked up when Seojun entered. Seojun sat across from him. They looked at each other. The coffee shop was otherwise empty except for the owner behind the counter, who had the self-possessed discretion of someone who had operated 3 tables for 20 years and understood that what happened at them was not his business. Director Yoon contacted me at 4:45 this morning, Lim said. His voice was papery, exhausted, the voice of a man who had been told things in the early hours that required significant revision of his understanding. She told me the Chung situation is being handled separately and that my involvement with the Incheon inquiry needs to be assessed for scope and direction. That's accurate, Seojun said. Lim looked at him. Park Ji-hye. Yes. I didn't know about Park Ji-hye. He said it directly, holding Seojun's eyes, the specific directness of a man who had decided that the only available currency was credibility and was spending it clearly. I want you to know that. What Baek was building through her, I didn't know the mechanism. I believe you, Seojun said. Lim blinked. He had not clearly expected that. He had prepared to be disbelieved and had prepared arguments, and they were now unnecessary, and the sudden unnecessariness of his preparation sat visibly in his expression for a moment before he set it aside. Then what do you need from me? I need the Cheong investigation to be conducted with the full weight of the Incheon exposure treated as a distinct inquiry from the death itself, Seojun said. The death is real, and it was ordered by Baek Junho, and it can be demonstrated. The Incheon exposure is a different file. Those files do not intersect in any document that passes through your office. That's a significant... It's what I need, Seojun said. In exchange, you have Baek Junho. Completely. His communications with Ha Soo-yeon, the Singapore financial documentation, the operative details of what he built and who he used to build it. It's enough for a prosecution that makes careers. You know it is. He held Lim's gaze. I'm offering you a case, Lim C., not a favor. A case you can stand behind in full daylight. Lim sat with this. He drank some of his coffee. He looked out the small window at the Bukchon Lane, which was empty at this hour, the old roof lines holding the gray morning sky in their angles. He had the look of a man putting down something he'd been carrying in a particular way for a long time and trying to understand what it felt like to carry it differently. Beck approached me 6 weeks ago, Lim said, to the window. He offered me specific financial documentation about the Incheon accounts in exchange for selective case management. I told him I'd review what he brought. I did not commit to anything. He looked back at Seojun. But I reviewed it, and I reached out about a meeting, because the documentation was real. I know, Seojun said. That puts me in a position. Yes. The position is manageable, Lim said slowly, working toward it, if the file that puts me in it doesn't exist as a formal document. The file is Min's, Seojun said. She doesn't formalize things that don't need to be formal. Lim looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Not agreement exactly. Acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who understood the room he was in and had decided to stay in it on terms he could live with. They sat for another 10 minutes. They drank their coffee. They spoke about the specific mechanics of the case handoff with the professional directness of people who had found a working arrangement and were implementing it without ceremony. When Seojun stood to leave, Lim said, Chung Man-soo worked for you for 19 years. Seojun buttoned his coat. Yes. I'm sorry, Lim said. He said it simply, without strategy. A human acknowledgement. Seojun looked at him. "Thank you," he said, and meant it, which was its own small surprise. He walked out of the coffee shop and into the Bukchon lane. The morning was fully arrived now. Gray still, cold still, but light in it, real light, the day committing to itself with the particular irrevocability of things that had already begun. The lane was beginning to show its first activity. A man opening a shop 3 doors down, the sound of a gate being rolled back somewhere around the corner, a cat on the stone wall performing the elaborate indifference of its species. Seojun stood in the lane and let the cold reach him. His phone showed one new message. It was from an address he did not recognize, which resolved after a moment into the NGO's staff directory system, auto-forwarded from the general contact to a personal account. He stared at it for a moment before opening it. It said, "She made me read her your note. She made me read it 3 times. She says to tell you that she was right, and you should know it by now." A pause between sentences, the paragraph break of someone who had stopped and started. "I don't know what any of this is. I know what it isn't, and I know what tonight was, and I'm not going to pretend I'm not still angry about the part where my daughter was in that room. But she's also not wrong, as usual. So, another pause. So, Happy New Year, Seojun-si." He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his coat pocket and stood in the Bukchon lane in the cold first morning of the new year, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely account for, the future felt like a place he was moving toward rather than a problem he was managing. He was 41 years old. He had built an empire on the understanding that power was the only reliable protection against a world that ate people who couldn't protect themselves. He had not been wrong about that. He had simply, somewhere in the arithmetic of building, forgotten to account for what protection was actually for. A man crossed the lane ahead of him, walking a small dog with the purposeful warmth of someone who had a reason to be out in the cold at this hour and was glad of it. Seojun watched him go. Then he walked out of the lane and back into the city, which was cold and enormous and entirely indifferent to him in the way that cities were, and which held in its ordinary moving noise. The traffic beginning to thicken, the first commuter buses, the shutters of businesses rolling up, the whole unremarkable mechanical beginning of another day. The ordinary evidence of people continuing, going about the work of their lives, finding their way between the places they needed to be. He walked. The city moved around him, and he moved through it, and the morning light came on slow and gray and honest over Seoul. And the new year was exactly 1 day old, and somewhere in a Mapo apartment, a woman who read people clearly was putting her daughter back to sleep. And in his inside breast pocket, a folded piece of paper said what it said. And he was not, for the first time in a long time, entirely sure what happened next. He found he could live with that. He walked on.